Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I never should have gone hiking alone. But how could I have known that my solo adventure would turn into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day? It was supposed to be a simple 3-day trek through the Cascade Mountains. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, and I felt confident in my abilities. The weather forecast was perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures. I had all the gear I needed, including my trusty tent, plenty of food, and a satellite phone for emergencies. What could possibly go wrong? The first day went exactly as planned. I made good time on the trail, stopping occasionally to admire the breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks and pristine alpine meadows. By late afternoon, I'd reached my intended campsite for the night, a small clearing near a bubbling stream. As I set up my tent and prepared dinner, I felt a deep sense of peace and contentment. This was why I loved solo hiking: the solitude, the connection with nature, the feeling of self-reliance. If only I'd known what was waiting for me in those woods. I woke early the next morning, eager to get an early start on what I knew would be a challenging day of hiking. As I emerged from my tent, stretching in the crisp morning air, something caught my eye. There, in a patch of soft earth near the stream, was a footprint. But not just any footprint. This was massive, easily twice the size of my own boot, and the shape was all wrong. It looked almost human, but too wide, with strange indentations where the toes should be. A chill ran down my spine as I examined the print more closely. Whatever had made this was big, really big, and it had passed through my campsite sometime during the night while I slept, blissfully unaware. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a deformed bear print, or someone playing a prank with fake Bigfoot feet. But deep down, I knew I was just lying to myself. This was something else entirely. I should have turned back right then and there, but a mix of curiosity and stubbornness drove me onward. I'd planned this trip for months, and I wasn't about to let some weird footprint derail it. So I packed up camp and hit the trail, pushing the unsettling discovery to the back of my mind. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush made me jump. More than once, I spun around, certain I'd seen movement out of the corner of my eye, but each time there was nothing there. Just trees and shadows. By late afternoon, my nerves were frayed. I decided to make camp early, hoping a good night's sleep would calm my paranoia. I found a small clearing that seemed defensible, with clear sightlines in all directions. As I set up my tent, I couldn't help but scan the tree line constantly, half expecting to see some monstrous shape emerge from the forest. Night fell, and with it came an oppressive silence. No crickets chirping, no owls hooting. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I crawled into my tent, zipping the door shut tightly behind me. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually exhaustion won out over fear. I'm not sure what woke me. A sound, a smell, some primal instinct warning of danger. Whatever it was, I found myself wide awake in the pitch darkness, heart pounding. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of bipedal movement just outside my tent, heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew closer, and I could hear deep, raspy breathing. It sounded like something big, something not quite human. Suddenly, a shadow fell across my tent, a massive, humanoid silhouette backlit by the moon. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before finally moving on. I don't know how long I lay there, shaking uncontrollably, straining my ears for any sound of the creature's return. Eventually, The sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Only then did I dare to unzip my tent and peer outside. The campsite looked undisturbed at first glance. But then I saw it. My backpack, which I'd left propped against a nearby tree, had been torn open. The contents were strewn about, and all of my food was gone. Even more unsettling were the tracks. Massive footprints, just like the one I'd seen the day before, circled my tent repeatedly before leading off into the forest. I knew I had to get out of there. Forget the rest of the trip. I needed to get back to civilization as quickly as possible. I hastily shoved what remained of my gear into my shredded backpack and hit the trail at a near run. That's when I felt it again, that prickling sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and froze. There, partially hidden behind a massive pine about 50 yards back, was a dark shape. It was hard to make out details, but I could see that it was tall, impossibly tall, and covered in shaggy hair. As I stared in horror, it shifted slightly, and I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the morning light, eyes that were fixed directly on me. I ran harder and faster than I'd ever run in my life, blind panic driving me forward. Branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled over rocks and roots, but I didn't dare slow down. I don't know how long I ran like that. It could have been minutes or hours. All I knew was that I had to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Finally, gasping for breath and on the verge of collapse, I allowed myself to stop and look back. The trail behind me was empty. Whatever had been watching me was gone, or at least out of sight. But that didn't mean it wasn't still out there, following at a distance. The rest of that day was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow looked like a monstrous shape. I pushed myself well beyond my normal limits, desperate to get off the mountain and back to safety. As the sun began to set, I finally caught sight of the trailhead and my parked car. I could have wept with relief. It wasn't until I was in my car, doors locked and engine running, that I allowed myself to break down. The tears came in heaving sobs as the full weight of what I'd experienced hit me. I was safe now, but I knew that a part of me would never leave those woods, the part that believed the world was a rational, explainable place, the part that thought humans were at the top of the food chain. I've tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, some combination of isolation and an overactive imagination. But in my heart, I know the truth. Something was out there in those mountains, something that defied explanation, something that saw humans not as the dominant species, but as prey. I've never gone hiking alone again, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched whenever I'm in the woods, because deep down, I know that it's still out there, waiting, watching, and someday, it might decide to do more than just watch. Story 2. They say the mountains watch you when you're alone. At least, that's what the old-timers used to tell us when we were rookies at the Park Service. I used to laugh it off. I had spent years out in the wilderness, seen just about everything this part of the Appalachians could throw at me. Bears, mountain lions, poachers, lost hikers. Nothing could surprise me anymore, or so I thought. Until the night the mountains proved the old-timers right. I was on my regular patrol, heading up a trail near Blackwood Ridge. It was late, probably pushing past 11 p.m., but I didn't mind. Night patrols were my favorite. There's something calming about the quiet of the woods at night, the way everything just slows down, how even the animals seem to respect the darkness. My flashlight was bobbing in front of me, casting long shadows as I made my way along the ridge. It was colder than usual for late spring, and a stiff breeze rattled the branches overhead, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth. I was about a mile into the trail when I noticed something odd. The dirt path, usually well-trodden and undisturbed, had deep indentations. They weren't like any tracks I'd seen before. Huge, clawed footprints, easily twice the size of my boot, sunk deep into the earth, as if something heavy had passed through recently. My stomach clenched. I kneeled down, running my fingers along the edge of the print. It was fresh. Whatever made it had been through here not long before me. Maybe a bear, But no, these tracks weren't right. Too long, too narrow. Bears don't leave prints like this. My radio crackled at my hip, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone out here, but I hesitated to call it in. What would I even say? That I found some strange tracks and wanted to chase after them like an idiot. I'd end up the butt of every joke back at the station. I stood up, scanned the area with my flashlight, and debated my next move. Rationality told me to keep walking, finish my route, and go home. Curiosity told me to follow the tracks. Curiosity won. I stepped off the trail, following the prints as they veered into the thicker part of the forest. The farther I walked, the more the air seemed to change. It was subtle at first, but the trees were getting denser, their trunks twisted, their branches gnarled like fingers reaching for something unseen. The wind had stopped, leaving the forest eerily still, and every sound seemed muffled, like I had crossed some invisible barrier. My heart was beating a little faster now. This part of the woods wasn't unfamiliar, but something about it felt wrong, off. The prints continued, leading me deeper into the shadows. I kept telling myself I'd turn around any second, that I was just checking to make sure no dangerous animals had wandered too close to the trail, but the truth was, I felt compelled, like something was pulling me forward, luring me deeper into the darkness. After about half a mile, the track stopped abruptly. I swung my flashlight around, scanning the forest floor, trying to figure out where they could have gone. The prints didn't lead anywhere. They just ended, right in the middle of a clearing. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but deeper. It reverberated through the trees, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. I slowly turned toward the sound. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees, their branches swaying gently in the dark. But then, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, something shifted. My heart skipped a beat. Something was watching me. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out much at first, just a vague, towering shape, too tall to be a bear, too broad to be a person. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I tried to focus on it, but whatever it was seemed to blend into the darkness, as if the shadows were part of it. I took a step back, my breath quickening. The growl came again, louder this time, and the thing shifted. It stepped forward, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. It was huge, easily over 7 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur that glistened in the moonlight. But what froze me in place were its eyes, glowing, almost amber, locked onto me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Its face was wrong, like something caught between a man and a wolf, elongated, with a snout full of sharp, gleaming teeth. But the worst part wasn't its size or its teeth. It was the way it moved, like it wasn't in a hurry, like it knew I wasn't going anywhere. My instincts finally kicked in. I turned and bolted. I wasn't even thinking. My body just reacted, my legs moving faster than I thought possible. Branches slapped at my face, my feet stumbled over roots, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away, had to put as much distance between me and that thing as possible. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, effortlessly keeping pace with me, its heavy breathing, that growl, closer now, so close I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. My lungs were burning, but I didn't stop. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me, and I went down hard, tumbling into a shallow ditch. Pain shot up my leg as I hit the ground, but I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp sting in my ankle. My flashlight had flown from my hand, flickering a few feet away, casting long, erratic shadows across the trees, and then everything went silent. The creature stopped. I could feel its presence nearby, but it wasn't moving. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint where it was. The forest was so still now, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. It was waiting, watching. My hand shook as I reached for my flashlight, grabbing it and flicking it back on. I swung the beam in every direction, searching for any sign of the creature, but it was gone. The tracks, the sound, everything. It was like it had never been there. But I knew better. I didn't waste any more time. I limped as fast as I could back to the trail, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig had my heart racing, convinced that at any moment it would be on me again. But the woods stayed quiet, too quiet. By the time I reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat, my hands trembling as I fumbled for the keys. I slammed the door shut and sat there for a moment, my breath ragged, trying to calm my racing heart. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It took a few minutes before I could drive. The road back to the station felt longer than it ever had before, the forest looming on either side, the headlights cutting through the thick darkness. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the tree line. When I finally reached the station, I didn't tell anyone, not at first. How could I? What would I even say? That I had been chased by some kind of creature, something that shouldn't exist. I tried to convince myself that it had been a bear, or a trick of the light, or that maybe I was just tired. But deep down, I knew the truth. The mountains had been watching me that night, and something had answered back. I don't patrol Blackwood Ridge anymore. I always find an excuse, some reason to avoid that part of the park. And every once in a while, late at night, I think I hear it again. A low, distant growl, carried on the wind, like it's still out there, waiting for me to come back. Story 3. The cabin stood like a forgotten relic, half buried in the dense forest and hidden from all but the most determined hikers. Its weathered logs were grey with age, and the roof sagged slightly, as though it had been waiting years for someone to notice it again. When we stumbled across it, deep in the woods, my buddy Travis turned to me with a grin that said everything I needed to know. He thought it was perfect, remote, quiet, the kind of place no one would expect two guys to be crashing for the night. I should have said no. Something about the cabin didn't sit right with me. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong, like it had been abandoned for a reason. But I didn't want to be the guy who backed out of an adventure, so I just shrugged and followed Travis inside, hoping the creeping unease in my gut would go away. It didn't. We pushed open the door, and the hinges screamed like they hadn't been oiled in decades. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. Dust clung to every surface, swirling in the weak beams of sunlight that managed to squeeze through the filthy windows. There was an old fireplace in the corner, a few pieces of broken furniture, and not much else. "Perfect," Travis said. "Just what we needed." "You sure about this place?" I asked, feeling the chill that had settled into my bones the moment we stepped through the door. "Dude, it's perfect," he replied, tossing his backpack onto the floor and collapsing into what used to be a chair. "No one's going to find us out here. We'll have the whole night to ourselves." I nodded, but my stomach churned. There was something off, the way the air seemed heavier, the way the shadows clung to the corners like they were hiding something. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to look like a coward. We got a fire going in the old fireplace, using some wood Travis had found outside. The flames flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, and I tried to push the uneasy feeling to the back of my mind. After a while, with the fire crackling and the warmth seeping into the cabin, things started to feel almost normal. We cooked some food, cracked open a couple of beers, and joked about how no one would believe we found such an awesome spot. By the time the sun had dipped below the trees and the forest outside was swallowed by darkness, I had almost convinced myself that everything was fine. Almost. Then the scratching started. It was subtle at first, like the wind brushing against the wooden walls. I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the old cabin settling. But as the night wore on, the sound became more persistent, a slow, deliberate scratching, like something or someone was clawing at the outside of the cabin. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the small room. Travis looked up from his beer, frowning. "What?" I paused, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. Then it came again, scratch, 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 right outside the front door this time. "There," I said, sitting up straighter. "That's scratching. You hear it now, right?" Travis's frown deepened, and he stood up, walking to the door. He pressed his ear against it, listening. After a few seconds, he shrugged and turned back to me. "Dude, it's probably just a raccoon or something. We're in the middle of the woods. It's not exactly the Ritz." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But that sound, it didn't feel like an animal. It felt deliberate, too slow, too controlled. I shook my head and stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack. "I'm gonna check it out." Travis laughed. "Seriously, you're getting spooked over a couple of scratches." I didn't answer him. I just flicked on the flashlight and opened the door, shining the beam outside. The cold night air rushed in, making the fire crackle louder, but there was nothing out there. No raccoon, no animal tracks, nothing, just the dense, silent trees and the cabin sitting in a clearing that seemed to hold its breath. I stood there for a minute, listening, trying to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at me. The forest was too quiet, not even the usual nighttime sounds, no crickets, no rustling of leaves, nothing, just silence. With a sigh, I stepped back inside and shut the door. "See? Nothing out there," Travis said, grinning like I was the one being ridiculous. "Now come on, sit back down. You're jumpy as hell tonight." I sat, but my nerves were shot. I kept listening, waiting for that sound again, but for a while it didn't come. The fire was starting to burn low, and I was beginning to think I had imagined it when the scratching started again, this time from the back of the cabin. I jumped to my feet before I even knew what I was doing. "Dude, seriously," Travis groaned. "You're killing the vibe." I ignored him, my heart hammering in my chest as I crept toward the back wall, where the sound was coming from. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was louder now, more insistent, like whatever was outside was trying to get in. I shone the flashlight toward the wall, but it didn't do much to cut through the shadows. Then it stopped. The scratching just stopped. I turned to look at Travis, my mouth dry. "That's not a raccoon." "Then what is it?" Travis said, his grin fading a little. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. Whatever was out there, it didn't feel right. There was a malevolence to that sound, something dark and old, something that made my skin crawl. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. And then the howling started. It was distant at first, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the woods, a long, mournful howl that sent a shiver down my spine. I froze, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. Travis stood up, his face suddenly serious. "That doesn't sound like a raccoon." The howl came again, closer this time, echoing through the trees. It wasn't a wolf. I've heard wolves howl before. This was something else, something deeper, more guttural, like it came from the throat of something that shouldn't exist. My heart was racing now, and every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, to run as far and as fast as I could. But my feet were rooted to the spot, my mind trying to process what I was hearing. Then something slammed into the side of the cabin, hard. The whole structure shuddered, the old logs creaking as if they might collapse under the force. Travis and I both jumped, our eyes wide with fear. Whatever was outside, it was strong, strong enough to take down the entire cabin if it wanted to. "We need to go," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. Travis nodded, his cocky grin gone, replaced with real fear. He grabbed his backpack and moved toward the door, but before he could reach it, there was another crash, this time against the front of the cabin. The door shook violently, the hinges straining under the impact. Something heavy was on the other side, pushing against it, testing its strength. We backed away from the door, our eyes locked on it, waiting for whatever was outside to break through. I shone the flashlight toward the windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there, but all I saw were shadows, shifting and swaying in the weak light. The howling came again, louder, closer. There were no words for the terror that sound brought with it. It was primal, something deep in my gut that told me we weren't supposed to be here. We were intruding. Something slammed against the door again, and this time the wood cracked. Splinters flew across the room, and Travis swore under his breath. "We need to move," I hissed, my mind racing. "We can't stay here." Travis nodded, his face pale. He grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and held it like a weapon, though we both knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was outside. With one last glance at the door, we made a break for the back window. It was small, barely big enough for us to squeeze through, but it was our only chance. Travis went first, shoving his pack through and then scrambling after it. I followed, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face as I wriggled through the narrow opening. We hit the ground running, not daring to look back. The howling followed us, echoing through the trees, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting as far away from that cabin as possible. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail, panting, our bodies shaking with adrenaline. Only then did we look back, expecting to see something chasing us. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest, as if the cabin and whatever had been there had never existed. But I knew better. Story 4. The Pacific Northwest has always felt like a place where the wild still rules. The air smells like damp earth, pine, and the kind of stillness that presses in from all sides, especially when you're alone. I've always loved that feeling, the sense that you're just a visitor in something much older, much bigger than yourself. But after that night, after what I saw out there on the trail, that stillness doesn't feel the same. Now, it feels like a warning. I had been backpacking solo for a few days, making my way along a remote trail that cut through the dense, ancient forests that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of hike I craved, the isolation, the quiet, the space to just be away from people and noise. The trip had been peaceful, uneventful, until I reached the last leg of the trail. It started with that feeling. You know the one, the prickling on the back of your neck when you know you're being watched. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself it was just nerves. After all, I hadn't seen a soul in days, and the only sounds were my own boots crunching through the underbrush and the occasional rustle of wildlife. But the sensation grew stronger with every step, that creeping unease settling in like a weight between my shoulders. I stopped for a moment, standing still in the middle of the trail, listening. The forest around me was unusually quiet, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the heavy silence that wrapped around everything like a thick blanket. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, expecting to see nothing, but I saw it. Something large, moving between the trees just far enough away that I couldn't make out details. It was fast, too fast for something its size, and it was gone before I could even blink. I stood frozen, my breath catching in my throat, eyes darting across the woods where I had seen it. A bear, I told myself, had to be, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The way it moved, it wasn't right. It wasn't lumbering like a bear would. It was too smooth, too deliberate, and it was standing upright. I swallowed hard and forced my legs to move again. My pace quickened, but I didn't want to break into a full run. Running in the woods, especially on uneven trails, is a great way to get yourself hurt. And if I did, there'd be no one around to help. I kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd seen wasn't done with me. The forest was still unnervingly quiet, and the air felt thicker, as if something was closing in. My eyes kept flicking to the tree line, and every now and then I thought I saw movement, just a glimpse of something shifting in the shadows, always staying just out of sight. I tried to focus on getting to my next campsite, but my mind kept going back to the size of that thing. It had been huge, easily over 7 feet tall, maybe more. And those glimpses, whatever it was keeping pace with me no matter how fast I walked. By the time I reached the spot where I planned to camp for the night, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The light filtering through the trees was fading, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. I set up my tent quickly, trying to keep my hands from shaking. I was telling myself that I was overreacting, that I was just letting my imagination get the better of me. But then, as I was gathering wood for a fire, I saw the prints. They were massive, far too large for any animal I'd ever encountered out here. They looked almost human. If humans had feet twice the size of any normal person and walked on their toes. My stomach twisted into knots as I knelt down to get a closer look. The prints were fresh, the edges crisp in the soft dirt. Whatever made them had passed through here recently, very recently. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees again, my heart pounding. The shadows were growing deeper, the light fading faster than I expected. I needed to get that fire going. Fire meant safety. Fire meant I could see what was coming. As the flames flickered to life, casting a faint orange glow around the campsite, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. I sat by the fire, my back against a tree, listening to the crackling wood and staring into the darkness beyond. The forest seemed to hold its breath around me, waiting, and then, just beyond the firelight, I heard it. A low, guttural growl, so deep that I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. My blood turned to ice. The sound was unmistakable, predatory, close, and unlike anything I'd ever encountered in the wild. I grabbed the nearest thing I had for protection, a small hatchet, though I knew it wouldn't be much help against whatever was out there. I shone my flashlight toward the trees, my hand shaking, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, just the trees and the firelight flickering against the trunks. But then, my light caught movement. A pair of glowing eyes reflected back at me from the darkness, just at the edge of where the light could reach. They were too high off the ground, easily at my eye level, if not higher. I couldn't make out the rest of its body, but those eyes, they were locked on me, unblinking, watching. I couldn't move. My brain was screaming at me to do something, run, scream, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare back at those eyes, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The growl came again, deeper this time, and the thing moved forward, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of it. Its silhouette was massive, its body covered in thick, dark fur. It walked on two legs, like a man, but there was nothing human about it. The way it moved, the sheer size of it. This was no bear. This was something else, something I couldn't explain. It stepped closer, just barely within the edge of the firelight now, and I could see more, its elongated snout, sharp teeth glinting in the faint glow. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. I gripped the hatchet tighter, knowing it wouldn't do a damn thing against something like that. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The creature stood there, staring at me, its chest rising and falling with slow, heavy breaths. For a moment, I thought it might attack, that I was about to meet a grisly end out here in the middle of nowhere, with no one around to know what happened to me. But it didn't. Instead, it just watched me, like it was waiting for something. I didn't move, didn't dare to even breathe too loudly. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. Was it sizing me up? Was it deciding if I was worth the effort? After what felt like an eternity, the creature took a step back, and then another, retreating into the darkness. I kept my flashlight trained on the spot where it had stood, but within seconds, it had melted back into the trees, leaving me alone with nothing but the crackling of the fire and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat there by the fire, gripping that hatchet, my eyes wide and darting toward every shadow, every sound. The creature didn't come back, but I could still feel it out there, watching, waiting. It never truly left. When the sun finally rose, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop moving until I reached my truck, hours later, my legs aching from the strain. The whole time, I could feel it behind me, just out of sight, following, keeping its distance but always there. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? A massive, bipedal creature stalking me through the woods like something out of a nightmare. They'd laugh me out of the station, but I know what I saw. I know what's out there, and I'll never hike those trails alone again. Story 5. The howl started 3 weeks ago. At first, we thought it was just wolves, nothing unusual for this part of the Rockies. But as the nights wore on, the sounds changed. They became deeper, more guttural, almost human-like at times. That's when the reports started coming in. And that's when my partner and I knew we were dealing with something far beyond our usual scope as park rangers. My name is Sarah Cavanaugh, and I've been a ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park for over a decade. I thought I'd seen it all: lost hikers, aggressive wildlife, the occasional poacher, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that night in the depths of the forest. It was a crisp autumn evening when my partner, Jakers, and I set out to investigate the latest round of disturbance calls. Campers in the eastern section of the park had reported strange noises and large, dark shapes moving through their campsites after dark. Management was concerned it might be an unusually bold bear, potentially rabid. They wanted us to check it out and, if necessary, tranquilize and relocate the animal. If only it had been that simple. We parked our truck at the trailhead and geared up. Standard equipment for a night patrol. Flashlights, bear spray, first aid kit. I checked my tranquilizer rifle, making sure it was loaded and the safety was on. Jake carried a shotgun loaded with beanbag rounds, last resort if the tranks didn't work. "You really think it's just a bear?" Jake asked as we started down the trail, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I shrugged, trying to ignore the unease settling in my stomach. What else could it be? Maybe a particularly large mountain lion, but that doesn't explain the howls. Jake nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He'd been a ranger even longer than me, and his instincts were sharp. If he was worried, that didn't bode well. We hiked in silence for about an hour, senses on high alert. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no owls hooting, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. It was as if every living thing was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. That's when we heard it, a low, rumbling howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started as something almost recognizable, like a wolf's call, but then it changed, deepening and taking on an almost human quality. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jake and I exchanged glances. This was definitely not a normal wolf or any other animal we'd encountered before. "Uber, should we call for backup?" I whispered, my hand instinctively moving to the radio at my belt. Jake shook his head. "Let's see what we're dealing with first. No sense alarming everyone if it turns out to be nothing." I nodded, though every instinct was screaming at me to turn back. We pressed on, following the direction of the howl. About a half-mile further, we came upon a small clearing. The moment we stepped into it, I knew something was wrong. The ground was torn up, as if a great struggle had taken place. And then I saw them, the carcasses. At least half a dozen deer lay scattered across the clearing, their bodies brutally mauled. This wasn't the work of a normal predator. The kills were too violent, too deliberate. It looked more like a massacre than a feeding. "Jesus," Jake muttered, crouching down to examine the nearest carcass. "What could have done this?" Before I could respond, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, weapons at the ready. The beam of my flashlight caught a flash of movement, something large, ducking behind a tree. "Hey!" Jake called out, raising his shotgun. "This is the park service. Come out slowly with your hands up." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from behind the tree. My breath caught in my throat. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. In the dim light, I could make out shaggy fur covering its body, massive, clawed hands, and a head that was a nightmarish blend of wolf and man. Time seemed to stand still as we stared at the creature, and it stared back at us with glowing, intelligent eyes. Then, faster than I thought possible for something so large, it charged. Jake fired, the beanbag round hitting the creature square in the chest. It should have dropped any normal animal, but this thing barely flinched. It barreled into Jake, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening thud. I raised my rifle, trying to steady my shaking hands. The tranquilizer dart hit the creature in the shoulder, but it seemed to have no effect. It turned its attention to me, lips pulling back in a snarl to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. I fired again and again, emptying the rifle. Some of the darts found their mark, but the creature kept coming. In desperation, I reached for my sidearm, knowing it would be useless against something this size. Just as the creature was about to reach me, a deafening roar split the night. Another massive shape burst from the tree line, colliding with my attacker. The two beasts rolled across the clearing in a fury of claws and teeth, giving me a chance to scramble to Jake's side. He was unconscious but breathing. I grabbed his radio, frantically calling for backup. "This is Ranger Kavanaugh. We need immediate assistance. Officer down and I trailed off, watching in horror as more shapes emerged from the forest, joining the fray. It was a pack of them, at least 5 or 6 massive, wolf-like creatures, all fighting amongst themselves. Their howls and growls filled the air, a cacophony of nightmarish sounds. I don't know how long I sat there, clutching Jake's limp form and watching the impossible scene before me. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before I heard the distant whoomp-whoomp of helicopter blades. The creatures must have heard it too. As suddenly as it had begun, the fighting stopped. The beasts turned as one to look in the direction of the approaching helicopter. Then, with one last bone-chilling howl, they melted back into the forest, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. The events that followed are a blur in my memory. The medical evac for Jake, the debriefing with park management, the official reports that carefully omitted any mention of impossibly large wolfmen. Jake recovered, but he took an early retirement. Can't say I blame him. As for me, I'm still here. Someone has to be, to keep an eye out, to protect the unsuspecting hikers and campers, because I know the truth now. Those creatures are still out there, hiding in the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. Waiting. Management has written off the whole incident. They say it must have been a pack of unusually aggressive wolves, or maybe a bear. They've increased patrols in the area, but otherwise consider the matter closed. But I know better. I've started my own research, digging into old legends and folklore. Werewolves, skinwalkers, dogmen. There are stories of creatures like what we saw in cultures all over the world. Most people dismiss them as myths and campfire tales. I know the truth is far more terrifying. I've taken to volunteering for every night patrol I can, especially around the full moon. I carry silver bullets now, though I'm not sure they'd do any good. Maybe it's futile, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm the only thing standing between those creatures and an unsuspecting public. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon is high, I hear them. Those howls echoing through the mountains, not quite wolf, not quite human. A reminder that the world is bigger and stranger than most people realize. A reminder that out here, humans are not at the top of the food chain. So if you're ever hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park and you hear an odd howl in the night, do yourself a favor. Pack up your camp, get back to your car, and drive until you hit civilization. Don't stop. Don't look back. Because if you see what's really out there in the darkness, your world will never be the same. I know mine isn't. Story 6. There's something unnerving about the stillness that only comes with freshly fallen snow. It muffles the world, swallows up sound, and leaves you feeling like the last person left on Earth. It was that kind of eerie quiet that settled over me as I made my way deeper into Yellowstone during one of my routine winter patrols. I'd been out there countless times before, but that day, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling, like a weight pressing down on my chest. But the park is huge, and winter in Yellowstone can feel desolate. It could have been nothing more than my own mind playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I told myself. The snow had fallen heavy the night before, blanketing everything in a thick, undisturbed layer. The trees bent slightly under the weight, their branches heavy with snow, and the trail I was following was completely covered. It wasn't unusual to be the first one through after a storm, but as I pushed forward, I noticed something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Footprints. They were massive, much larger than anything I'd ever seen, and they weren't the kind left by a boot or even a bear. They were human-like in shape, at least in the sense that they had toes, but they were too long, the stride too wide. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt down to examine them more closely. Each step was deeply indented, as if whatever made them was impossibly heavy. I stood up, scanning the area, my heart thudding in my chest. The tracks led away from the trail, heading into the dense trees off to my left. Part of me knew I should just leave it. Follow the normal patrol route, mark the tracks in my notes, and move on. But another part of me, the part that had been doing this job for years, the part that didn't like leaving mysteries unsolved, won out. I started following the tracks. With every step, the air seemed to grow colder, the silence deeper. I felt like I was walking into something, though I didn't know what. The trees closed in around me, the snow crunching under my boots the only sound in the world. The tracks remained steady, each one just as fresh as the last, meaning whatever had made them had passed through recently. Too recently. After about half a mile, the tracks led me to the mouth of a cave. It was tucked into a rocky outcrop, the entrance dark and foreboding, the kind of place you'd never stumble upon unless you were looking for it. My first thought was that it had to be an old bear den, though I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I stood at the entrance, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The tracks disappeared into the cave, and as much as my instincts told me to turn around, the curiosity gnawed at me. I took out my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam slicing through the darkness ahead. Just a quick look, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. The cave was narrow at first, the walls damp and cold, the ground uneven under the snow. My footsteps echoed off the stone, and the air inside was stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. As I went deeper, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and the smell hit me. Something foul, like decay mixed with wet earth. That's when I heard it. A low growl, so deep and guttural that I felt it in my bones before I heard it with my ears. I froze, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand as I tried to figure out where the sound had come from. The cave walls played tricks with the acoustics, and it felt like the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Another growl, closer this time, and followed by a shuffling sound. Something was moving deeper in the cave. My breath hitched, and I forced myself to take a step back, my instinct screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn around, something shifted in the darkness at the edge of my light. I swung the flashlight toward it, and for a brief second, I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, amber and predatory, stared back at me from the shadows. They were set too high off the ground for any bear, and the outline of the creature was massive, hunched, like a figure too big for the cave it was lurking in. Its breath came in heavy, ragged pants, filling the cave with a stench that turned my stomach. My heart pounded in my ears as I took another step back, the realization settling over me like ice water down my spine. This wasn't a bear. The creature took a step forward, and I caught a glimpse of its full form. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark as the cave itself, but it wasn't the fur that chilled me. It was its shape. It stood on two legs, towering over me even in its hunched position, with long, muscular arms that ended in claws sharp enough to cut through stone. Its face, God! Its face was twisted, almost human, but with a snout full of teeth, sharp and gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. I didn't wait for it to make the next move. I turned and bolted, my boots slipping in the snow and uneven ground as I scrambled back toward the cave's entrance. Behind me, I heard it roar, a sound so loud and unnatural that it felt like the entire mountain trembled in response. My lungs burned as I ran, the cold air slicing into my throat, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The daylight hit me like a punch when I burst out of the cave, my chest heaving as I stumbled through the snow. I could still hear it behind me, its massive body crashing against the stone walls as it tried to follow. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. My only thought was to get the hell away from there. I ran, following the tracks I had made on the way in, praying they'd lead me back to the safety of the main trail. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in closer, like even they were trying to trap me there. Every breath felt like fire in my lungs, but I didn't stop running, not until I was sure the sounds of the creature had faded. Finally, when my legs couldn't take it anymore, I slowed down, my body trembling from both the cold and the adrenaline coursing through me. I bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for air as I listened to the stillness around me. The forest was quiet again, eerily so, but the growls, the heavy footsteps, they were gone. Whatever had been in that cave hadn't followed me out into the open. I looked back in the direction I had come from, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the tree line, but there was nothing, just the snow and the trees, as if nothing had happened, but it had. I knew what I saw, what I felt, and the worst part was knowing that the thing, that creature, was still out there, hiding in the caves and shadows, waiting for the next poor soul to wander too close. I made it back to the trailhead by nightfall, my body exhausted, my mind racing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. How could I? Who would believe me? The park is full of stories, myths, and legends about strange things lurking in the woods, but I had always chalked them up to the imagination, to the kind of folklore that's passed around a campfire. But this was no story. This was real. Now, whenever I go out on patrol, I make sure to avoid that part of the park. I tell myself it's because there are easier routes, safer paths, but deep down, I know it's because I don't want to risk it. I don't want to see those eyes again, or hear that growl echoing through the trees, because out there, in the depths of Yellowstone, something is waiting, something that isn't supposed to exist, and I was lucky enough to walk away from it. Not everyone will be. Story 7. The first night in the forest, we all heard the voice. It drifted out of the trees like a whisper, too quiet to be real, but there it was, calling our names. I tried to laugh it off with the others, playing it cool, telling myself it was just the wind, but in the back of my mind, something about it made my skin crawl. No one else was supposed to be out here. No one even knew we were camping this deep in the Minnesota woods. We were just a bunch of friends, 5 of us, looking for an escape from the stress of real life. The kind of trip where you leave your phones in the car and just soak in the quiet. We had planned it for months, hiking, fishing, cooking over a campfire, and maybe knocking back a few beers as the sun went down. It was supposed to be simple, peaceful. But when the first night fell, something else found us. It was Josh who heard it first. We were all sitting around the fire, joking about high school and old stories, when he suddenly sat up, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he said, cutting off Travis mid-sentence. We all went quiet, straining our ears. The fire popped and crackled, the flames licking the cool night air. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of the trees swaying in the breeze, and then, faintly, a voice. "Josh!" It was barely audible, like it was coming from somewhere deep in the woods, far beyond where any person could be standing. But it was unmistakable. It said his name. We all exchanged nervous glances, the playful banter that had filled the air just moments ago evaporating. "Very funny, guys," Josh said, though his voice was shaky. "Which one of you is messing with me?" But no one was laughing. I could see in everyone's faces that they had heard it too, and that none of us were faking it. "It's probably the wind," Maria said, her voice betraying the nervousness she was trying to hide. She stood up, dusting off her jeans. "I'm going to the tent. I'm beat." The rest of us agreed. The fire that had been our comfort suddenly felt inadequate, the dark woods pressing in closer with every minute. I couldn't help but feel eyes on us, hidden in the thick trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. We doused the flames and retreated to our tents. I shared one with Josh, and as we zipped it up, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Neither could he. "That was weird, right?" he whispered, lying flat on his back, staring up at the nylon ceiling. "Yeah," I muttered, "but it's just the woods. Sounds can mess with you out here." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But as the night wore on, I couldn't sleep. The wind rustled the trees outside, but beneath it I swore I could hear movement, footsteps, maybe, soft, almost like they were circling our campsite. I thought I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me after what had happened earlier, but then I heard it again, the voice. Alex. It was my name this time, and it was closer, much closer. I shot up, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel Josh stir beside me, but I didn't want to wake him. I didn't want to freak him out. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The forest was still, bathed in darkness, the fire pit now a cold circle of ash. I strained my ears, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath, fast and shallow. Whatever had called my name wasn't out there anymore, or, at least, I couldn't see it. I lay back down, pulling my sleeping bag up to my chin, trying to calm myself. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the wilderness playing tricks. I kept telling myself that as I drifted into a fitful sleep, the next morning, no one said anything about the voices. Maybe we were all too embarrassed to bring it up, or maybe we just wanted to pretend it hadn't happened. We spent the day hiking, fishing, trying to enjoy the trip we had planned for so long, but there was an unease hanging over the group, like we were all waiting for something to happen. By the time the sun started to set again, I could feel the tension in the air. We built the fire up a little higher, sat a little closer together, but none of it helped. That night, the voice came back, and it wasn't just calling names anymore. We were all sitting around the fire again, the atmosphere tense, when it started. This time, the voice was louder, closer. "Josh, Maria, Alex, come into the woods." It was the same voice, but there was something wrong with it. It was flat, hollow, like it was trying to mimic a human voice, but not quite getting it right. We all froze, staring at each other in the firelight. I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. "That's not the wind," Maria whispered, her face pale. "That's something out there." "Maybe someone's messing with us," Travis said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "Like some local kids or something." "Travis?" The voice cut through the silence, echoing through the trees. That was enough for me. I stood up, heart pounding, trying to look brave, but every part of me was screaming to leave. "We need to go," I said, grabbing my pack. "Now this isn't right." The others hesitated, looking at each other like they weren't sure what to do. But then we heard it again, the sound of footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. Something was moving through the trees, coming closer. "Come into the woods," the voice called again, so close now that it felt like it was right behind us. Without another word, we grabbed our gear, frantically packing up. The forest around us was deathly quiet, but I could feel it. Whatever was out there was watching us, waiting. We didn't waste time. We left the campsite and started hiking back toward the main trail, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps as I tried to stay calm. But no matter how far we walked, I could still hear it, the sound of footsteps following us. And then we lost Josh. 1 second he was walking ahead of me, just a few feet away. The next he was gone. No sound, no scream, nothing. Just gone. I turned around, shining my flashlight in every direction, calling his name, but there was no answer. The others circled back, their faces pale with fear. But we couldn't find him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. "Josh!" I shouted, my voice breaking, panic rising in my throat. "Josh, where are you?" But there was only silence. And then, the voice again, louder now, echoing through the trees like a twisted imitation of life. "Josh is gone." Maria let out a choked sob, and Travis grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tight with fear. "We'll find him. We just need to get out of here." We started running then, the forest closing in around us, the trees casting long, sinister shadows. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing us, something unseen but relentless. And then we heard Josh's voice. "Guys, help me," it called from somewhere in the distance. "I'm over here." We froze. It was Josh's voice, but it was wrong. It had the same flat, hollow tone as the voice we had been hearing all night. Maria shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "That's not him," she whispered. "Help me." The voice called again, closer now, and that's when I knew we couldn't stop. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken Josh, it wasn't human. We ran faster, the sound of the voice echoing behind us, calling our names, begging us to come back. But we didn't stop until we broke through the tree line, collapsing on the main road where we had parked the car. We never found Josh. The search parties combed the woods for days, but there was no trace of him. No body, no tracks, nothing. It was like he had never existed. But I know what happened. We all do. There's something in those woods, something that mimics your voice, that calls your name, and once you listen, once you follow, it's already too late. Story 8. I've spent most of my life exploring caves, squeezing through narrow passages and descending into the depths where no light reaches. It's a kind of silence and darkness you can't find anywhere else, and for some reason, it's always drawn me in. But the cave I found last spring, it was different. I've never been one to scare easily, but what I found down there still haunts me. I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out. The day started like any other trip. I had heard about a cave system in the Rockies that wasn't on any of the tourist maps, uncharted by most. A few locals mentioned it in passing, a system hidden deep in the forest, accessed by a tiny, half-overgrown trail that didn't even have a name. That kind of thing is like gold to someone like me. If no one's been there, it means there's still something to discover. I hiked for hours before I found the entrance. It wasn't much to look at from the outside, a narrow crack in the side of a rocky outcrop, barely wide enough for a grown man to slip through. I stood there for a moment, just staring at it. The air coming from the crack was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year. But I shrugged it off. Caves are often colder, and I wasn't about to let a chill stop me. Squeezing through the entrance, I found myself in a narrow tunnel that quickly opened into a larger chamber. My flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating rough stone walls and a low ceiling. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. The thrill of discovery was starting to bubble up inside me, pushing away any sense of caution. The deeper I went, the more excited I became. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, and I was sure no one had mapped this place. But then, something strange started to happen. The walls weren't smooth and natural anymore. They were marked, almost as if something had clawed at them. At first, I thought it might be old tool marks, signs that someone had been here long ago, but these weren't the kind of scratches left by chisels or picks. They were deep, uneven, and far too wide. I stopped and knelt down, running my fingers along one of the gouges in the stone. The groove was at least an inch deep, and it stretched along the wall in a jagged line. I glanced back at the narrow passage I had just come through, suddenly aware of how isolated I was. The air was thick, heavier than before, and my flashlight beam seemed weaker, as if the darkness was swallowing it. I stood up quickly, shaking off the creeping unease that had begun to settle in my stomach. It was just a cave, nothing more. I had been in places like this before. Tight, dark, eerie. There was no reason for me to feel anything other than excitement, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I heard the first sound. It was subtle, a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the stone far ahead of me. I froze, holding my breath, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Then it came again, closer this time. I slowly swung my flashlight toward the direction of the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. The tunnel ahead stretched on, curving slightly to the left, disappearing into the black. My mouth went dry. I've encountered animals in caves before. Bats, snakes, even the occasional lost raccoon. But this sounded bigger, heavier. I told myself it was just the echo playing tricks on me. Sound behaves strangely in caves, bouncing off the walls in ways that make it seem like it's coming from all directions. But something deep in my gut told me that wasn't it. I debated turning back. There was no shame in leaving and coming back with more gear, maybe even a second person, but the thought of leaving without knowing what was making that noise, without discovering whatever was at the end of this tunnel, pushed me forward. The tunnel began to narrow again, forcing me to crouch as I moved deeper. The walls closed in, the ceiling so low now that I could barely stand upright. The air was damp, and the smell, something sharp and metallic, hit me like a punch to the face. It was the unmistakable scent of blood, thick and fresh. My flashlight flickered. I cursed under my breath, shaking it. The beam steadied, but it was weaker now, barely cutting through the dark. I moved slowly, every muscle in my body tense, the scraping sound growing louder with each step. It was unmistakable now. Something was in here with me, and then I saw it. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one larger than the last, the ceiling rising high above me. But it wasn't the size of the chamber that made my stomach drop. It was the bones. Piles of them, scattered across the floor, some bleached white, others still covered in bits of flesh. Animal bones, mostly. Deer, rabbits, maybe a bear. But there were others too, smaller, human-shaped, skulls with empty sockets staring back at me from the dark. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. My foot hit something soft, and I turned, the beam of my light falling on a fresh carcass. An animal, torn open, its innards spilling out onto the cold stone. The blood was still wet, pooling at my feet. And then the scraping stopped. The silence was deafening. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, the chamber was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, something was standing at the far end of the room. It was hunched, its back nearly touching the ceiling, covered in matted, filthy fur. Its arms were long, too long, ending in massive hands tipped with claws that scraped the stone floor. But it was the face that made my breath catch in my throat. It was wrong. The features were almost human but stretched, distorted, with glowing yellow eyes that locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't. My brain refused to process what I was seeing, refused to accept that this thing was real. It was like some horrible combination of man and beast, like it had crawled out of some nightmare and into the waking world. Then it growled, a deep, guttural sound that shook the walls, reverberating through the chamber, rattling my bones. My instincts kicked in, finally breaking me free of the paralysis that had gripped me. I turned and ran. The tunnel was narrower than before, or maybe it just felt that way with the creature chasing me. I could hear it behind me, its claws scraping against the stone, its growls growing louder with every second. My heart pounded in my ears, and every breath burned in my chest as I scrambled through the dark, my flashlight flickering wildly in my hand. I could feel it gaining on me, the air growing colder, the sound of its breath filling the tunnel. The entrance was still so far away, and my legs were screaming for me to stop, to give up. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I burst through the narrow opening, back into the first chamber, the daylight filtering in from the crack in the rock. I didn't stop. I dove through the entrance, scrambling out into the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the growling stopped. I lay there in the snow, my body trembling, my mind racing. The entrance was silent. The creature hadn't followed me out. It was still in there, lurking in the dark, waiting. I never went back. I don't think I could, even if I wanted to. I don't tell people about what I saw, because no one would believe me. They'd think it was just the dark playing tricks on me, or that I had imagined it all. But I know what I saw. And now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it, the sound of claws scraping against stone, somewhere deep in the earth, waiting. Story 9. You can tell when you're being hunted. There's a shift in the air, a prickle along your spine, and every instinct in your body tells you to run. I've been a hunter for years, spent more nights in the woods than I can count, but I've never felt like prey. At least, not until that night in the Maine wilderness. It was supposed to be just another routine hunting trip. I'd come up to this part of the woods every season, setting up camp far from the main trails where the animals were plentiful and the people weren't. This time, though, it was different. I could feel it the moment I stepped out of my truck. The woods were quieter than usual, too quiet, like even the animals had decided to steer clear of this place. I shook it off. I wasn't the kind to get spooked by some silence. If anything, it meant fewer distractions, more focus. I grabbed my rifle, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started my hike into the woods. The trees here were thick, their branches twisted and gnarled, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, damp from the recent rain, muffling the sound of my footsteps. After a few hours of hiking, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with just enough space for a fire and my tent. I went through the usual motions, setting up the tent, gathering firewood, making sure my gear was in order. The sun was starting to dip low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the trees, and for a moment I almost felt at peace. But that feeling didn't last. As the fire crackled and darkness crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, but I didn't see anything. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I tried to laugh it off, blaming it on the isolation. Hell, I'd been out here alone plenty of times before, and nothing had ever happened. But this time felt different. I cooked some dinner over the fire, the smell of sizzling meat filling the air, and for a while it distracted me. As the food cooked, I started to relax, convincing myself that the quiet was nothing more than the woods settling in for the night. That's when I heard the first snap. It was subtle, just the sound of a twig breaking somewhere off in the distance. I stopped, my hand hovering over the pan, listening. The crackling of the fire was the only sound for a long moment, but then I heard it again. Closer this time. Something was moving out there. I stood up slowly, reaching for my rifle, my eyes locked on the trees. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows that made it hard to see beyond the first few rows of trees. My heart started to beat faster, and every muscle in my body tensed. "Probably just a deer," I muttered to myself, trying to sound calm. But my voice felt too loud in the stillness. I waited, rifle in hand, listening. The wind rustled through the branches overhead, but that was it. No more footsteps, no more snapping branches. Just silence. I forced myself to sit back down, keeping the rifle close. The fire was dying down, so I fed it some more wood, watching the flames grow brighter. I tried to focus on the warmth, on the familiar comfort of being out in the woods, but that creeping feeling of being watched wouldn't go away, and then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There, at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the shadows, something moved. It was tall, too tall to be a man, but it was standing upright. My heart skipped a beat. It was just a dark shape, barely distinguishable from the trees around it, but I knew it was there, watching me. I raised the rifle, the barrel trembling slightly as I aimed it toward the figure. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steady, but inside, my gut was churning. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. This area was remote, far from any trail or cabin, and even if there were another hunter, no one would be stupid enough to stalk a camp like that. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I stood there, finger hovering over the trigger, waiting for something to happen. But after what felt like an eternity, the shape just melted back into the woods. It was like it had never been there at all, just swallowed by the darkness. I lowered the rifle, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept staring at the spot where it had stood. half expecting it to come back, to charge out of the trees, but nothing happened. For the next hour, I couldn't sit still. Every little noise, the wind in the trees, the crackle of the fire had me on edge. I kept the rifle close, my eyes darting back and forth between the shadows, trying to catch any sign of movement, but the figure didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me. I hadn't slept in over a day, and my body was starting to give out. I climbed into my tent, laying the rifle next to me, and pulled the zipper closed. It wasn't much of a barrier, but it felt better than nothing. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, and my eyes would snap open. But each time, there was nothing, just the endless black of the woods pressing in on all sides. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again, the snap of a branch. This time, it was right outside my tent. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs. Slowly I reached for the rifle, my fingers fumbling in the dark as I pulled it close. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body tense. Something was walking around my campsite. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but they weren't human footsteps. They were too heavy, too deliberate. I stayed perfectly still, my mind racing. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and methodical, like whatever was out there was studying me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My hands shook as I gripped the rifle tighter. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped, right at the entrance to my tent. I could hear it breathing, deep, heavy breaths, like something massive standing just outside the thin fabric separating me from whatever was out there. My pulse roared in my ears, my body frozen in fear. And then the tent shifted. Whatever it was, it pressed its weight against the fabric, pushing it inward, as if it was trying to get in. The material strained, the shape of a large, clawed hand pressing against it. I could see the outline of it, distorted by the thin material, and my stomach twisted into knots. I didn't know what to do. If I fired the rifle, I'd be shooting blind through the tent. But if I didn't, the pressure eased, and the hand slowly slid away. The footsteps started again, moving away from the tent, back into the woods. I lay there, not daring to move, barely breathing. I listened as the footsteps faded, swallowed by the trees, and then silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, rifle clutched to my chest, too afraid to move. The night seemed to stretch on forever, every second dragging out as I waited for the creature to return. But it didn't. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I scrambled out of the tent, my legs shaky and weak. The campsite looked untouched, no sign of what had been out there, no tracks, no disturbed ground. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. I packed up my gear in record time, barely looking over my shoulder as I hiked back to the truck. The woods were quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of peace I'd felt before. It was an eerie, expectant silence, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. I haven't been back to those woods since. I've heard the stories, the legends of creatures that stalk the forests of Maine, but I always figured they were just that, stories. But now, I know better. Story 10. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 2 decades, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, capture some shots of the local fauna for a nature magazine. Instead, I found myself face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that has shaken my understanding of the natural world to its core. My name is Alex Chen, and this is my story. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Spend a week camping in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, documenting the diverse wildlife of the region. I'd done similar jobs countless times before, so I packed my gear with the casual efficiency of a seasoned pro. Camera equipment, tent, supplies, everything I'd need for a solitary week in the wilderness. The first few days were uneventful. I got some great shots of elk, a family of black bears, and even a few elusive mountain lions. But it was on the 4th night that everything changed. I had set up camp in a small clearing, my tent nestled between two massive Douglas firs. As the sun set, I sat by my small campfire, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. The forest around me was alive with the usual nighttime sounds, owls hooting, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. Normal, peaceful. Then suddenly everything went quiet. It was as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment, the forest was buzzing with life. The next, absolute silence. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that when the forest goes quiet, it usually means a predator is nearby. I quickly packed away my equipment and retreated to my tent, senses on high alert. That's when I heard it, a sound I'd never encountered before in all my years of outdoor work. It was a rhythmic knocking, like someone striking wood against wood. Knock, 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 over and over again, coming from different directions around my campsite. My first thought was that it must be other campers, maybe trying to communicate with each other. But something about the sound felt off. It was too regular, too deliberate. And why would other campers be out there in the middle of the night, so far from any established trails? The knocking continued for what felt like hours, though my watch told me it was only about 20 minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the knocking had been. I'd like to say I was brave enough to go out and investigate, but the truth is, I was paralyzed with fear. I lay in my sleeping bag, straining my ears for any sound, any clue as to what was out there. Sleep was out of the question. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent and peek outside. The clearing looked undisturbed, exactly as I'd left it the night before. No footprints, no signs of any visitors. I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, or if maybe I'd dozed off and dreamed it. But then I saw the trees. On several of the surrounding pines, about 7 feet up, there were fresh marks in the bark, clean, horizontal gouges that could only have been made by something with significant strength and sharp claws. Whatever had made those marks was big, much bigger than a bear. I should have packed up right then and hiked back to civilization. That would have been the smart thing to do. But I'm a photographer, and my curiosity often overrides my common sense. Plus, I reasoned, if there really was some unknown creature out here, what an incredible opportunity to document it. So I stayed. I spent the day setting up trail cameras around my campsite and in the surrounding area. If anything came back, I was determined to get it on film. As night fell, I found myself both dreading and anticipating a repeat of the previous evening's events. I sat by my campfire, camera in hand, ready for anything. The forest was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not the eerie silence of the night before, but more like a hushed anticipation, like the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it, the wood knocking again, but closer this time. Much closer. It was coming from just beyond the tree line, barely 50 yards from where I sat. I raised my camera, heart pounding. The full moon broke through the clouds, bathing the clearing in silvery light, and that's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in shaggy hair. Its silhouette was unmistakably ape-like, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, the shoulders too broad to be any known primate. For a moment, it just stood there, half hidden by the shadows of the trees. I raised my camera with shaking hands, desperately trying to steady myself enough to get a clear shot. Click. The sound of the shutter seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. The creature's head snapped towards me, and I found myself staring into eyes that reflected the moonlight like a cat's. But these weren't the eyes of an animal. There was an intelligence there, a self-awareness that sent chills down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then with a speed and grace that should have been impossible for something so large, it turned and melted back into the forest. I'd like to say I gave chase. that I bravely pursued this incredible discovery. But the truth is, I was rooted to the spot, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. It wasn't until the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon that I finally managed to move. With trembling hands, I checked my camera. Had I really captured an image of the creature, or had it all been some sort of hallucination brought on by isolation and fear? As the photo appeared on the screen, my breath caught in my throat. There it was, grainy and slightly out of focus, but unmistakable. A massive ape-like figure standing at the edge of the clearing. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the legend made real. I spent the rest of the morning in a daze, breaking down my camp and packing up my gear. As much as part of me wanted to stay, to try and get more evidence, a larger part knew it was time to go. I'd seen something I shouldn't have, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As I hiked back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a massive, hair-covered figure. More than once, I thought I caught glimpses of movement just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I made it back to my car without further incident, but the drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions. Excitement at what I'd discovered warred with a deep, primal fear. I knew I had evidence that could shock the world, that could rewrite our understanding of zoology and anthropology, but I also knew that going public with this would change everything, not just for science, but for me personally. In the end, I decided to keep the photo to myself, at least for now. I told myself it was to protect the creature, to prevent hordes of hunters and curiosity seekers from descending on its habitat. But if I'm being honest, it was also about self-preservation. I've seen the ridicule faced by others who've claimed to encounter Bigfoot. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. So here I sit, weeks later, still wrestling with what I saw that night. The photo sits on a secure hard drive, both proof and burden. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring at it, reliving those moments in the moonlit clearing. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear a faint knocking coming from the woods behind my house. Knock, 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 knock. I tell myself it's just my imagination, just the branches of trees striking each other in the breeze. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things out there in the wilderness, things that defy explanation, and once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. The world is bigger and stranger than we know. And sometimes, when we venture into the wild places venture back into us. Story 11. The mist rolled in faster than I expected, thick and heavy, swallowing everything around our campsite. One minute we were laughing, sharing stories around the fire, and the next we were completely isolated, cut off by a dense wall of fog that muffled every sound. It was like the world had vanished, leaving just the four of us in a bubble of silence. At first, we thought it was just another strange turn of the Smoky Mountain weather. But we were wrong. Something was out there, hidden in the mist. The fire crackled softly, its light barely penetrating the fog that pressed in on all sides. I could hardly see the outline of the trees, just faint shadows looming at the edges of my vision. The others, Sam, Greg, and Rachel, sat huddled closer to the fire now, their earlier laughter replaced by nervous glances and forced smiles. "This is weird, right?" Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she didn't want to disturb the stillness. Her eyes darted around, scanning the mist for something none of us could see. Greg shrugged, trying to keep it casual. "It's just fog. It happens, especially this deep in the mountains." But even he didn't sound convinced. There was something unsettling about the way the mist moved, almost like it was alive, swirling and shifting just beyond the firelight. I could feel it too, that creeping sense that we weren't alone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I tried to laugh it off, but the feeling stuck. "I've never seen fog this thick," Sam muttered, poking at the fire with a stick. "It's like it came out of nowhere." I nodded, my stomach twisting with unease. The silence was what got to me the most. Usually, even at night, the forest was alive with the sounds of insects, the rustle of leaves, the occasional owl. But now, nothing. Just the crackling of the fire and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of the mist shifting around us. "I'm going to check the perimeter," I said, standing up and grabbing my flashlight. I didn't want to admit how uneasy I was, but something felt off. I needed to move, to do something other than sit there and wait for the fog to swallow us whole. "You sure that's a good idea?" Rachel asked, her eyes wide. "I'll be fine," I said, trying to sound confident. "I'm not going far." The flashlight beam barely pierced the fog as I stepped away from the fire. The trees loomed like dark shadows around me, their shapes distorted by the thick mist. Every step I took felt wrong, like I was moving deeper into something I couldn't escape. My heart thudded louder in my chest with each passing second. I made my way around the edge of the campsite, my boots crunching softly on the forest floor. The fire grew dimmer behind me, its light fading into the mist until it was just a faint glow in the distance. I felt like I was walking in a dream, every sound muted, every movement slow and deliberate. That's when I heard it. A soft, distant sound, a footstep. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. At first I thought it was just the others moving around the campsite, but the sound came from deeper in the woods, beyond where they were sitting. My hand tightened around the flashlight as I swung the beam in the direction of the noise. "Hello!" I called out, my voice barely louder than a whisper. Nothing, just the shifting mist. I took a step closer, my pulse racing. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the ground in front of me. The trees were just dark shapes in the distance, their outlines blurred and distorted. The quiet was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. Then I heard it again. Another footstep. This time, closer. I turned sharply, shining the light into the fog, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam caught something, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall, humanoid, but there was something wrong about the way it moved. Too slow, too deliberate, like it was stalking me. "Greg, Sam," I called out, my voice shaky now. "Is that you?" No answer. The figure disappeared into the fog, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. My brain scrambled to make sense of what I'd just seen, but nothing fit. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. And whatever it was out there, circling us. I hurried back to the campsite, my skin prickling with fear. The others were still by the fire, talking quietly, their faces pale in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely steady. They looked at me, confusion and fear flickering in their eyes. "Hear what?" Greg asked, standing up. "Footsteps. Something's out there, moving around. I saw something in the fog." Sam stood up now, his expression serious. "What do you mean, something?" I shook my head, trying to find the words. "I don't know. It was tall, like a person, but it moved weird. Like it wasn't human." Rachel's face went pale, and she glanced around the mist. "You're messing with us, right? This is just one of your pranks." "I'm not messing with you," I snapped, my heart racing. "There's something out there." The fire crackled, its light flickering as if even it was afraid. For a moment, none of us spoke, the tension thick in the air. Then, just beyond the edge of the firelight, we heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep. We all turned toward the sound at the same time, eyes wide with fear. The mist shifted, parting slightly, and for a brief second, we saw it. A dark shape, taller than any of us, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but the outline of its body was unmistakable. Twisted, wrong, like it was mimicking a human form, but not quite getting it right. "Oh my God," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, its presence suffocating, as if the mist itself was alive with its malice. "We need to get out of here," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. No one argued. We grabbed our things as fast as we could, shoving supplies into our packs with shaking hands. The figure remained still, its gaze locked on us. unblinking. It felt like a predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As we started to move, the footsteps followed, slow, heavy, echoing through the mist. The further we walked, the more the fog seemed to close in on us, thickening with every step, until the world around us was nothing but white and shadows. The fire's glow disappeared behind us, swallowed by the fog. I led the way, my flashlight barely cutting through the mist, my heart hammering in my chest. The others followed close behind, their breaths coming fast and shallow. The footsteps never stopped. They matched our pace, staying just out of sight, but always there, stalking us. "We're almost to the trailhead," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince them or myself. But the mist didn't let up. It was like we were walking in circles, the same twisted trees appearing over and over again. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see the shadow, closer now, moving through the fog with terrifying patience. Then, just ahead, I saw something, a break in the fog, the trailhead. Relief washed over me as I hurried forward, the others close behind. But as we reached the clearing, I realized something was wrong. The mist hadn't thinned. It had changed. Instead of dispersing, it now swirled around us, thicker than before, forming a wall that trapped us in the clearing. And the footsteps stopped. We stood there, panting, eyes darting around in panic. The shadow was gone, but the silence pressed in like a physical weight. Then out of the mist, a voice. "Stay." It was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a chill down my spine. We looked at each other, fear gripping us in a way I had never felt before. Then the voice came again, louder this time, surrounding us. "Stay with me." Without another word, we bolted. The mist seemed to pull at us, slowing our movements, but we pushed through, running blindly into the night, away from the voice, away from whatever had followed us in the fog. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, lungs burning, legs shaking. The mist didn't follow us there. It stayed behind, lingering at the tree line, watching. I don't know what it was, or why it chose us. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back into those woods again. The fog isn't just weather in the Smoky Mountains. There's something in it, something ancient, something that waits for people like us. And once it finds you, it doesn't let go. Story 12. I've always loved the thrill of adventure, the rush of adrenaline that comes with pushing your limits. But there are some limits that shouldn't be pushed, some boundaries of nature and reality that are better left uncrossed. I learned that lesson the hard way, on a ski trip that turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. My name is Jack Donovan, and this is the story of how I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist. Something that has haunted my dreams ever since. It was supposed to be the ultimate backcountry skiing experience. Me and 3 of my closest friends, Sarah, Mike, and Liam, had been planning this trip for months. We were all experienced skiers and had done our fair share of off-piste adventures, but this was going to be something special. A week in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, just us and the untouched powder. We'd checked the weather forecast obsessively in the days leading up to our departure. It called for clear skies and perfect conditions. We should have known better than to trust long-range forecasts in the mountains. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We carved our way through pristine snow, whooping with joy as we blazed trails where no one had skied before. We set up camp each night under star-filled skies, sharing stories and dreams around the warmth of our portable stove. On the 3rd day, everything changed. We woke to grey skies and a biting wind. As we packed up camp, fat snowflakes began to fall. By the time we'd strapped on our skis, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. "Maybe we should head back," Sarah suggested, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. I shook my head. "We've come too far to turn back now. Besides, the nearest town is further away than our planned route. We'll push through to the next valley. There should be some shelter there." Looking back, I wish I'd listened to Sarah, but I was too stubborn, too confident in my abilities. It's the kind of arrogance that gets people killed in the wilderness. We set off into the blizzard, keeping close together to avoid getting separated. The wind drove the snow horizontally, stinging our faces even through our goggles and face masks. Visibility was down to mere feet, and the howling of the wind seemed to come from all directions, disorienting us. Hours passed, though it was hard to tell how many in the uniform whiteness of the storm. We should have reached the valley by now, but all I could see was an endless expanse of snow-covered slope. "Jack!" Mike's voice cut through the wind. "We need to stop. We're lost." I knew he was right, but stopping out here in the open, exposed to the full fury of the storm, wasn't an option. That's when I saw it, a dark shape looming out of the whiteness. "There!" I shouted, pointing. Looks like some kind of structure." We made our way towards it, hope giving us a second wind. As we got closer, I could make out the shape of a cabin. It was old and weathered, its log walls grey with age, but it looked solid, a miracle in this wilderness. We staggered up to the door, our skis sinking deep into the snow that had drifted against the cabin's walls. The door wasn't locked, just stuck from disuse. It took all four of us pushing to force it open. Inside, it was dark and musty, but blessedly free from the howling wind. We stamped the snow from our boots and looked around. It was a simple one-room cabin, clearly long abandoned. A rusty wood stove sat in one corner, and rough-hewn bunks lined the walls. It wasn't much, but it would keep us alive. "What are the odds?" Liam laughed, the relief evident in his voice. "Finding this place in the middle of nowhere. Let's not question our luck," I said, already moving to check out the wood stove. "Let's just be grateful we're not out in that storm." We set about making the cabin as comfortable as possible. There was a stack of firewood next to the stove, and soon we had a fire going, filling the small space with warmth and flickering light. We laid out our sleeping bags on the bunks and hung our wet outer layers to dry. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind howled around the cabin, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. We huddled around the stove, sharing the last of our trail mix and trying to keep our spirits up with jokes and stories. That's when we heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on us, but then I saw the looks on my friends' faces and knew they'd heard it too. It was a scream, high and inhuman. It cut through the howling of the wind like a knife. It sounded almost like a woman in pain, but distorted, wrong somehow. "What the hell was that?" Mike whispered, his face pale in the firelight. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Do you know how it can sound weird sometimes, especially in the mountains?" But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. That sound wasn't the wind. It was something else entirely. We fell into an uneasy silence after that, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire crackled in the stove, and the wind continued its assault on the cabin, but underneath it all, we were listening, waiting to hear that sound again. We didn't have to wait long. The scream came again, closer this time. It was followed by another and another, until the air was filled with a chorus of otherworldly wails. They seemed to be coming from all around us, as if we were surrounded. Sarah scrambled to the window, wiping away the frost to peer out into the darkness. "There's something out there," she gasped. I don't know what I saw. I joined her at the window, squinting into the swirling snow. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a shape moved in the darkness, tall and gaunt. It was barely visible against the white of the storm. As I watched, another appeared, and another. Pale, emaciated figures, moving with an unnatural grace through the deep snow. "What are they?" Liam whispered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, unable to speak. These things, whatever they were, defied explanation. They were vaguely humanoid, but too tall, too thin to be human, and the way they moved, it was all wrong, like puppets on strings. One of the creatures turned towards the cabin, and I found myself staring into eyes that glowed red in the darkness. A wave of primal fear washed over me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything to get away from those eyes. but there was nowhere to run. We were trapped in this cabin, surrounded by things that shouldn't exist. The creatures began to circle the cabin, their unearthly screams rising to a fever pitch. We huddled together in the center of the room, watching the windows and the door, praying that the old logs would hold. That's when the scratching started. It began softly at first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, more frenzied. They were trying to get in. "Daitum, we need to barricade the door," I said, snapping out of my fear-induced paralysis. "Grab anything you can move." We sprang into action, pushing the heavy bunks against the door and windows. The scratching intensified, accompanied now by a pounding that shook the entire cabin. The old logs creaked and groaned under the assault. For hours we huddled in that cabin, listening to the maddening sounds of the creatures trying to break in. The fire in the stove burned low, and the temperature began to drop. None of us dared to open the door to get more firewood. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the barricaded windows, the sounds outside began to fade. The screams grew distant, then stopped altogether. The scratching and pounding ceased. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Finally, when the sun was fully up, I worked up the courage to move one of the bunks and peek out the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed. Fresh snow covered everything, pristine and untouched. There was no sign of the creatures, no footprints, nothing to indicate that anything had been out there at all. Had we imagined it all? Some kind of shared hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the stress of the blizzard. But the deep gouges in the cabin's door and walls told a different story. We didn't stay to investigate further. As soon as we were sure it was safe, we grabbed our gear and skied out of there as fast as we could. We made it back to civilization later that day, sunburned, exhausted, and fundamentally changed by what we'd experienced. I've never gone back to those mountains, and I never will. The others feel the same way. We don't talk about what happened that night, not even among ourselves. It's too unbelievable, too terrifying to put into words. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind is howling outside my window, I find myself straining to listen. And in those moments, I could swear I hear something underneath the wind, a high, inhuman scream calling from somewhere in the darkness. And I know that out there, in the wild places of the world, there are things that defy explanation, things that hunt in the night, things that are best left undisturbed, because once you've seen them, you can never unsee them, and you'll never feel truly safe in the darkness again. Story 13. When the distress call came in, I thought it would be a routine rescue. Lost hikers, maybe a sprained ankle. I've been on the search and rescue team for Glacier National Park for over a decade, and I've seen it all, or so I thought. Nothing could have prepared me for what we found in those snowy woods. It was a night that changed everything I thought I knew about the natural world and about what really lurks in the wilderness. My name is Mark Tanner, and this is the story of the most terrifying rescue mission of my life. It was a cold February evening when the call came in. 2 hikers, a couple in their late 20s, had gone off trail and gotten lost as darkness fell. With a storm rolling in, the situation was critical. We quickly assembled a team, myself, my partner Jake, and 2 newer members, Sarah and David. As we geared up, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Something about this call felt different, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the desperation in the voice of the ranger who'd taken the initial report, or the unusually specific coordinates the hikers had managed to provide despite being lost. Whatever it was, it had my hackles up. We set out just as the first snowflakes began to fall. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I knew we were in for a rough night. The coordinates led us deep into a particularly remote section of the park, an area I'd only been to a handful of times in all my years on the job. As we hiked, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the trees, driving the snow horizontally. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. We had to stay close together to avoid getting separated in the whiteout conditions. "Mark!" Jake called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. And maybe we should turn back, wait for the storm to pass. I shook my head, forgetting for a moment that he probably couldn't see the gesture. We can't, I shouted back. Those hikers won't survive the night out here. We push on. And so we did, fighting against the wind and snow with every step. Hours passed, though it was hard to tell how many in the uniform whiteness of the storm. We should have reached the coordinates by now, but there was no sign of the lost hikers. That's when Sarah spotted it, a flash of color against the snow. We rushed forward, hope giving us a second wind, but as we got closer, my heart sank. It wasn't the hikers. It was a backpack, torn and bloodied, half buried in the snow. What could have done this? David asked, his voice shaking as he examined the shredded fabric. I didn't answer. I was too busy scanning our surroundings, suddenly acutely aware of how exposed we were. Whatever had destroyed that backpack could still be out there. We spread out, searching for any sign of the hikers or what might have attacked them. That's when I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they must belong to a bear, despite how unusual it would be for one to be active in this weather. But as I looked closer, I realized these were no bear tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own boot print, and the shape was all wrong. They looked almost human, but distorted, with strange indentations where the toes should be. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. I'd heard stories, of course. Every SAR member had. Tales of strange creatures in the woods, of things that shouldn't exist. But I'd always dismissed them as campfire stories, the product of fear and isolation playing tricks on people's minds. Now, faced with these impossible tracks, I wasn't so sure. "Guys!" I called out, my voice tight. "I think we need to—" A scream cut me off, high and terrified. It cut through the howling wind like a knife. We all froze for a moment, then sprinted towards the sound without a word. We burst into a small clearing, flashlights cutting through the swirling snow. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. One of the hikers, a young woman, was huddled at the base of a tree, her eyes wide with terror, and looming over her was something that should not exist. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. In the beam of my flashlight, I could see that it was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its body was emaciated, skin pulled tight over an impossibly gaunt frame. Patchy fur covered parts of its body, and its hands ended in long, vicious claws. But it was the head that truly chilled me to my core. It was like a deer's skull, but larger, with massive antlers that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They burned red, filled with an intelligence and malevolence that was unmistakably not of this world. For a moment, we all stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then the creature turned those burning eyes on us and let out a sound that I can only describe as a roar, though it was like no animal sound I'd ever heard before. "Run!" I screamed, snapping out of my shock. "Everyone, run!" We scattered, the creature's roar spurring us into action. I sprinted towards the hiker, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Jake raising his rifle, but before he could fire, the creature moved. It was impossibly fast for something so large. One moment it was across the clearing, the next it was on Jake, antlers lowered like a battering ram. I heard a sickening crunch as Jake was thrown backward, his rifle flying from his hands. "Jake!" Sarah screamed, starting towards him, but David grabbed her, pulling her back. "We have to go," he yelled. "Now!" I hated leaving Jake behind, but I knew David was right. We couldn't fight this thing. Our only hope was to run, to somehow make it back to safety. And so we ran. We ran like we'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush, slipping and sliding in the snow. The roars of the creature echoed behind us, spurring us on even as our lungs burned and our legs threatened to give out. I don't know how long we ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually the roars faded, and the only sound was our ragged breathing and the crunch of snow under our feet. Finally, when I felt like I couldn't take another step, we stumbled upon an old ranger cabin. We piled inside, slamming the door behind us and pushing every piece of furniture we could find against it. As the adrenaline faded, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. Jake was gone. We'd left him behind. And that thing, that impossible, nightmarish thing was still out there. The hiker we'd rescued, Emily, we learned, was in shock. Between sobs, she told us how she and her boyfriend had been attacked by the creature, how he'd told her to run while he tried to distract it. She'd heard his screams as she fled. We spent a terrifying night in that cabin, jumping at every sound, convinced that at any moment that skull-faced monstrosity would come crashing through the door. But morning came, and with it, clear skies. When we finally worked up the courage to venture outside, there was no sign of the creature, no tracks in the fresh snow, nothing to indicate that the events of the previous night had been anything more than a shared nightmare. But we knew the truth. We'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that defied explanation. The official report, of course, makes no mention of skull-faced monsters or glowing antlers. It talks about a bear attack, about how we heroically rescued one hiker, but tragically lost a team member in the process. Search parties found what was left of Jake's body and Emily's boyfriend. The injuries were attributed to a grizzly, but I know the truth. And so do Sarah and David and Emily. We don't talk about it, not even among ourselves. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what then? Some things are better left in the shadows. But I'll tell you this, I don't go into the backcountry anymore. Not at night, and especially not when it snows, because I know what's really out there. I've seen it with my own eyes. And I know that sometimes, when a hiker goes missing in Glacier National Park, it's not exposure or a fall or even a bear that's responsible. Sometimes it's something much, much worse, something with burning red eyes and antlers that glow in the dark, something that shouldn't exist but does, and God help you if you ever find yourself lost in its hunting grounds. Story 14. I've been a hunter all my life. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, knew every creature that called them home. But on that crisp autumn day, I learned how wrong I was. I learned that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that turn the hunter into the hunted. This is the story of the day I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that still haunts my dreams. My name is Tom Hawkins, and this is how I survived an encounter with a creature straight out of nightmare. It was late October, the heart of elk season. I'd been planning this solo hunting trip for months, scouting locations and tracking elk movements. I'd found a promising area deep in the national forest, far from the usual hunting spots. It was a grueling 6-hour hike from the nearest road, but I was sure it would be worth it. I set out before dawn, my pack heavy with supplies for a week-long stay. The forest was quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my boots and the occasional call of a bird. As the sun rose, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. This was where I belonged. By mid-morning, I'd reached my chosen campsite, a small clearing near a bubbling stream. I quickly set up my tent and stashed my supplies before heading out to do some scouting. The area looked promising, with plenty of signs of elk activity, fresh droppings, bark rubbed off trees by antlers, well-worn game trails. I was confident I'd bag my elk within a day or two. As evening approached, I made my way back to camp. That's when I first felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to trust my instincts, so I paused, scanning the trees around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling persisted. I tried to shake it off as I prepared my dinner over a small campfire, but as darkness fell, the feeling only intensified. The usual nighttime sounds of the forest seemed muted, as if the wildlife was holding its breath. That night, I slept fitfully, waking at every small sound. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but eager to start hunting. Maybe bagging an elk would chase away this inexplicable unease. I set out early, moving quietly through the underbrush. About an hour into my hunt, I spotted fresh elk tracks. Big ones. This had to be a bull, and a large one at that. My excitement momentarily overshadowed my lingering sense of disquiet. I followed the tracks carefully, all my senses on high alert. The trail led me deeper into the forest, into an area so thick with trees that little sunlight penetrated. The air felt cooler here, damper. I could smell decaying leaves and rich, loamy soil. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement about 100 yards ahead. I raised my rifle, peering through the scope. For a moment, I thought I'd found my elk. But as I focused, I realized this was something else entirely. It was large, that much I could tell, but it moved in a way no elk ever did. It was bipedal, walking on two legs with an odd, loping gait. I caught glimpses of shaggy fur and what looked like elongated arms. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe. But bears don't walk on two legs for extended periods, and this thing's movements were too fluid, too purposeful. I lowered my rifle, blinking hard. When I looked again, the creature was gone. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen, or was my mind playing tricks on me after a restless night? Shaken, I decided to head back to camp. I could resume the hunt later, after I'd had some rest and food, but as I turned to retrace my steps, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The tracks I'd been following, the ones I'd thought belonged to an elk, they'd changed. Where before there had been clear hoof prints, now I saw something else. Something that looked disturbingly like an oversized human footprint, but with clear claw marks at the toes. Panic gripped me. I started moving faster, no longer caring about stealth. I just wanted to get back to my camp, to grab my things, and get the hell out of these woods. But with each step, I became more and more certain that I was being followed. Twigs snapped behind me. I heard heavy breathing that wasn't my own, and always, that feeling of eyes on me, watching my every move. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush. Looking back was a mistake, because when I did, I saw it. The creature, it was running after me on two legs, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something its size. In that brief glimpse, I took in details that my mind still struggles to process. It was at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in hands with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me. It was a horrifying amalgamation of wolf and human features, with glowing yellow eyes that shone with an unnatural intelligence. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear the creature behind me, its breathing a low, guttural growl that spurred me on. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs were on fire, my legs threatening to give out. But finally, mercifully, I burst out of the trees and onto a logging road, and there, like a miracle, was a beat-up pickup truck. An old man was standing next to it, looking startled at my sudden appearance. I didn't waste time with explanations. I just yelled at him to get in the truck, to drive. Something in my voice or my wild-eyed appearance must have convinced him, because he didn't argue. We peeled out onto the road just as the creature emerged from the trees. As we sped away, I looked back. The thing stood at the edge of the road, watching us go. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. Then, as I watched, it turned and melted back into the forest. The old man, Jim, I later learned, took me back to town. He didn't ask many questions, for which I was grateful. I don't know what I would have told him anyway. How do you explain something like that? I never went back for my gear. As far as I'm concerned, the forest can keep it. I haven't been hunting since that day. I can't bring myself to set foot in the deep woods, not after what I saw. I've done research since then, trying to make sense of what happened. I've read about Dogman sightings, about creatures that blur the line between wolf and man. Some of the descriptions match what I saw. But reading about it and coming face to face with it are two very different things. I know how this story sounds. Believe me, I know. If someone had told me this tale a few years ago, I'd have laughed it off as a campfire story or the product of too much whiskey. But I know what I saw. I know what chased me through those woods. It was real as you or me, and it's still out there. So if you're ever deep in the forest and you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that sense of being watched, don't ignore it. Don't tell yourself it's just your imagination, because sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and not everything in this world is as we think it is. There are creatures out there, things that lurk in the shadows of the wilderness, things that defy explanation. And if you're unlucky enough to encounter one, pray that you're faster than I was. Pray that you can outrun not just the creature, but the knowledge that comes with seeing it. Because once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. And you'll never look at the woods the same way again. As for me, I'll stick to the city from now on. At least here, the only monsters are the humankind. And those, at least, I understand. Story 15. I've always been drawn to the underground, to the dark, twisting passages that honeycomb the earth beneath our feet. As a caving enthusiast, I've explored some of the most challenging cave systems in the world. But nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered in those unmapped tunnels. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Instead, it became a nightmare that still haunts my every waking moment. My name is Alex Mercer, and this is the story of how I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that has shaken my understanding of reality to its core. It all started innocently enough. My team, consisting of myself, my longtime caving partner Sarah, and two newer members, Mike and Jess, had heard rumors of an unexplored cave system in a remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. The locals spoke of strange sounds coming from the hillsides, of livestock going missing, and of an oppressive feeling of dread that hung over the area. Most wrote it off as superstition, but to us, it sounded like the perfect challenge. We arrived in the small mountain town on a crisp autumn morning. The locals were wary of us, their eyes following our every move as we geared up. An old man approached us as we were about to set out, his weathered face creased with concern. "You folks best reconsider," he said, his voice gravelly with age. "Them caves ain't natural. There's things down there that ought not be disturbed." We laughed off his warning, chalking it up to local folklore. If only we had listened. The cave entrance was hidden behind a thick curtain of kudzu, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. As we pushed through the vegetation, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool air emanating from the cave mouth. We switched on our headlamps and began our descent. The first few hours were exhilarating. The cave system was unlike anything we'd ever seen before. Massive chambers gave way to narrow passages that required us to squeeze through on our bellies. Crystalline formations glittered in the beams of our lights, creating a magical, alien landscape. But as we pushed deeper, things began to change. The air grew thicker, heavier somehow. Our voices seemed muffled, as if the very rock around us was absorbing the sound. And then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic chanting echoing through the tunnels. At first, I thought it must be water dripping, or the wind finding its way through some unseen passage. But as we paused to listen, it became clear that this was something else entirely. The sound was too regular, too deliberate to be natural. "What is that?" Jess whispered, her voice tight with fear. I shook my head, unable to answer. Part of me wanted to turn back right then and there, but curiosity, that damnable curiosity that had led me into countless dangerous situations before, drove me forward. We pressed on, following the sound. The passages began to change, becoming smoother, more regular. It was as if they had been carved by tools rather than formed by natural processes. And then we saw the first of the cave paintings. They were crude, but undeniably deliberate. Stick figures with elongated limbs and what looked like antlers or horns sprouting from their heads. They seemed to dance across the cave walls, engaged in some sort of ritual around a central figure that made my skin crawl just to look at it. "This is impossible," Sarah muttered, running her hand over the paintings. These caves were supposed to be unmapped, unexplored. Who could have done this? Before anyone could answer, the chanting grew louder. It seemed to be coming from just ahead, around a bend in the passage. We exchanged nervous glances, then slowly crept forward. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, so large that our lights couldn't reach the far walls or ceiling. But it wasn't the size of the room that made us gasp in unison. It was what was in it. In the center of the chamber stood a circle of standing stones, each easily 20 feet tall. They were covered in carvings similar to the paintings we'd seen, but more intricate, more disturbing somehow. And gathered around these stones were things. I hesitate to call them people, though they stood on two legs and had a vaguely humanoid shape. They were tall, inhumanly so, and painfully thin. Their skin was pale to the point of translucence, as if they had never seen the sun. But it was their heads that truly terrified me. They were elongated, with massive, branching antlers sprouting from their skulls. Their faces were like nothing I'd ever seen. No nose, no mouth that I could discern, just large, black, almond-shaped eyes that reflected our light like a cat's. For a moment, we stood frozen in horror, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then one of the creatures turned those terrible eyes towards us, and a sound filled my head, not heard with my ears, but felt in the very core of my being. It was a scream, a roar, and a command all at once. "Run!" I yelled, snapping out of my trance. "Everyone, run!" We turned and fled, our earlier careful exploration forgotten in our panic. We crashed through narrow passages, scraped ourselves bloody, squeezing through tight spots, all the while aware of the sounds of pursuit behind us. I don't know how long we ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that lightless hell. But eventually, mercifully, we saw a glimmer of natural light ahead. With a final burst of desperate energy, we burst out of the cave entrance and into the fading evening light. We didn't stop running until we reached our car. As we sped away from that godforsaken place, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale, antlered head emerging from the cave mouth. But then we rounded a bend, and it was gone. The locals weren't surprised when we came tearing into town, wild-eyed and babbling about what we'd seen. They listened to our story with grim faces, nodding as if it confirmed their worst fears. The old man who had warned us was there, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and, "I told you so. They've been down there for longer than any of us can remember," he said. "Longer than there's been towns in these hills. They sleep for long years, then wake and hunt. You're lucky you made it out alive. We left town that night and never went back. We didn't report what we'd seen. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what then? Some things are better left undisturbed. I haven't been caving since that day. I can't bring myself to enter the darkness, not after what I saw lurking in those depths. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that chanting, feel that alien presence in my mind, and I wonder, did we really escape, or did we bring something back with us, something ancient and patient, waiting for its moment to emerge? I don't know if those creatures were some lost branch of human evolution, or something else entirely, something not of this world. All I know is that they exist, hidden away in the dark places of the earth. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see those reflective black eyes staring back at me, and I hear that otherworldly chanting echoing in the depths of my mind. So if you're ever exploring a cave and you hear something that sounds like chanting, something that doesn't quite sound natural, don't investigate, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Turn around, get out, and don't look back. Because there are things in this world that we're not meant to see, things that should remain hidden in the darkness. And once you've seen them, you can never unsee them. They become a part of you, a shadow on your soul that never quite goes away. Take it from someone who knows. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some depths are better left unplumbed, because you never know what might be waiting down there in the dark, watching and hungry. Story 16. I've battled wildfires for over a decade, but nothing in my training prepared me for what we encountered in those remote mountains. We thought we were just fighting another blaze, but what we found in that hidden valley changed everything. I thought I knew about the world. Some secrets are hidden for a reason, and some discoveries are better left unmade. My name is Jack Reeves, and this is the story of how a routine fire turned into a nightmare that still haunts my dreams. It was late August, the heart of fire season in the Pacific Northwest. We'd been battling blazes non-stop for weeks, jumping from one hotspot to another. When the call came in about a new fire in a remote section of national forest, we were exhausted but ready. Just another day on the job, or so we thought. Our team of 6 loaded up the helicopter at dawn. As we flew over the burning forest, I could see this was no ordinary fire. It moved erratically, defying the wind patterns and natural barriers that usually dictate a fire's path. It was as if the flames had a mind of their own, deliberately avoiding certain areas while consuming others. We touched down on a ridge overlooking the blaze. The heat was intense, the air thick with smoke. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed something odd. Despite the ferocity of the fire, the wildlife didn't seem to be fleeing. If anything, they seemed to be moving towards a particular section of the forest that the fire hadn't touched. Something's not right here, I muttered to my second-in-command, Sarah. She nodded, her eyes scanning the tree line. I've got a bad feeling about this one, Jack. We set to work, creating fire breaks and dousing hotspots. But no matter what we did, the fire seemed to have a life of its own. It would retreat from our efforts in one area, only to flare up unexpectedly in another. It was maddening, like trying to fight a living, thinking opponent. As the day wore on, the fire's strange behavior became impossible to ignore. It consistently avoided a particular valley, creating a perfect horseshoe of flames around it. The untouched area stood out like a green island in a sea of fire and smoke. We need to check that out, I decided, pointing to the valley. Something's protecting that area, and I want to know what. Sarah looked uneasy but didn't argue. We left the rest of the team to continue firefighting efforts and made our way down into the valley. As we descended, the air grew cooler, the smoke thinning out. It was as if we were entering a different world. The valley floor was lush and green, untouched by the destruction raging above. Ancient trees towered overhead, their canopies so thick they almost blocked out the sky. The silence was eerie after the roar of the fire. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. The only sound was the muffled crackling of the distant flames. We pushed deeper into the valley, our unease growing with each step. That's when we saw the first structure, a crude hut made of branches and animal skins. It looked primitive, like something from a prehistoric era, but it was clearly inhabited. "What the hell?" Sarah whispered, her hand instinctively moving to her axe. Before I could respond, we heard a rustling in the undergrowth. We spun around, hearts pounding, and that's when we saw them. They emerged from the shadows of the forest like ghosts, humanoid figures, but unlike any humans I'd ever seen. They were short, maybe 5 feet tall at most, with powerful, stocky builds. Their skin was a deep, earthy brown, and they were covered in a light coat of fur. But it was their faces that truly shocked me. They were primitive, almost ape-like, with heavy brow ridges and no chins to speak of. Their eyes, though, were startlingly intelligent, watching us with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. For a long moment, we all just stared at each other. I could feel my worldview shifting, everything I thought I knew about human evolution and history crumbling in the face of these impossible beings. One of the creatures stepped forward. He carried a wooden spear tipped with what looked like obsidian. He made a series of grunting sounds, gesturing at us with his free hand. "Jack," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking, Are we seeing what I think we're seeing?" I couldn't answer. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what was in front of us. These creatures looked like something out of a paleontology textbook, like a missing link between apes and humans. But they were here, alive, in a hidden valley, in 21st century America. The lead creature grunted again, more insistently this time. When we didn't respond, he turned and barked something to the others. They began to spread out, circling around us. I could see more of them emerging from the trees, dozens now. Some carried spears, others held rocks or crude clubs. "We need to go," I said, slowly backing away. "Now." But as we turned to leave, we found our path blocked by more of the creatures. They had us surrounded. The message was clear. We weren't going anywhere. What followed was the most surreal experience of my life. The creatures herded us deeper into the valley, to a larger clearing filled with more of the primitive huts. There must have been 100 of them, maybe more. A whole tribe, hidden away from the modern world. They took our equipment, examining our radios and flashlights with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. We tried to communicate, to explain that we meant no harm, but the language barrier seemed insurmountable. As night fell, the creatures gathered around a large fire in the center of their village. They seemed to be debating something, gesturing at us frequently. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were deciding our fate. "What do we do?" Sarah asked, her voice low. "They can't keep us here forever." "The team will come looking for us." I wasn't so sure. The fire was still raging above us. Our team would be too busy fighting it to worry about our absence for a while. And even if they did come looking, would they ever find this hidden valley? As if in answer to my thoughts, a commotion broke out among the creatures. They began pointing at the sky, chattering excitedly. I looked up and felt my heart sink. Through a gap in the canopy, I could see a helicopter circling overhead. Our backup had arrived. The creatures' agitation grew. Some began grabbing weapons, while others herded their young into the huts. The leader approached us, his expression grim. He pointed at the helicopter, then at us, grunting questioningly. I realized with a chill what he was asking. Did these beings belong to us? Were more humans coming? I had a choice to make. I could try to signal the helicopter, to escape this primitive world and return to the safety of civilization. But what then? Once this valley was discovered, these creatures' way of life would be destroyed. They'd be captured, studied, their hidden world invaded by scientists and government agents. In that moment, looking into the earnest, frightened eyes of the creature before me, I made my decision. I shook my head vehemently, pointing to the helicopter and then making a shooing motion. "No," I said, knowing he couldn't understand the word but hoping he'd grasp my meaning. "Not with us. Go away." The creature studied me intently, then nodded slowly. He turned and barked orders to his tribe. They began scattering, disappearing into the forest with astonishing speed. The leader turned back to us, gesturing for us to follow him. He led us to the edge of the valley, to a steep path that led back up to the burning forest above. With one last, long look, he pointed up the path, then melted back into the shadows of his hidden world. Sarah and I exchanged glances, then began the climb. By the time we reached the top, the fire had died down considerably. We found our team easily enough, concocting a story about getting turned around in the smoke. I've never told anyone the truth about what we saw in that valley. Who would believe us? And even if they did, I couldn't bear the thought of those peaceful beings being disturbed. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if it was all a smoke-induced hallucination. But then I remember the intelligence in those eyes, the weight of millennia of hidden history, and I know it was real. The official report talks about an unusually difficult fire, nothing more. The untouched valley is mentioned as a quirk of terrain and wind patterns, but I know the truth. I know that hidden away in those mountains there's a lost world, a people that time forgot, and I pray they stay forgotten, because in forgetting they remain free. In silence they remain safe. Some discoveries are better left unmade, some secrets better left buried, for in those hidden places magic still exists, and the impossible remains possible. Story 17. It's a quiet, eerie evening when I first see the rocks. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest cloaked in that bluish twilight where shadows seem to stretch and grow. I've been a park ranger for 10 years, seen my share of strange things out here, but there's something about this that puts my senses on edge. The stacked rocks, oddly shaped, some smooth, some jagged, are piled in a perfect spiral in the middle of the trail. They're unnatural, like a marker or some kind of warning. I stop and stare, my skin prickling. Someone or something put these here. I scan the surrounding woods, my flashlight cutting through the dense underbrush. It's dead silent, no wind rustling through the leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. My hand unconsciously moves to the radio strapped to my shoulder, but I hesitate. What would I even say? Hey, I've got a spooky rock formation here. It sounds ridiculous, even to me. Still, I can't shake the unease that settled deep in my gut. I crouch down, examining the stones. They're not the kind you'd just find lying around on this trail. Most of the ground here is littered with pine needles and roots, not rocks of this size. These have been deliberately brought here from somewhere else. I count the stones, 12 in total, arranged with precision. That's when I feel it, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like eyes boring into me. I stand up slowly, my heart thudding in my chest. The beam of my flashlight dances over the trees as I turn in a slow circle, searching. My breath catches when I spot it, just beyond the tree line. A figure, large, motionless, almost camouflaged against the thick trunks of the pines. It's standing upright, tall, too tall. At first, I think it's just a trick of the light, some tree that vaguely resembles a person. But then it moves, just the slightest tilt of its head, and I see the glint of eyeshine. I freeze, my blood running cold. The thing watching me isn't a bear, that's for damn sure. I force myself to take a slow, deep breath, to fight the rising panic clawing at my insides. My fingers find the radio, and I press the button. "Base, this is Ranger Wilkins," I say, my voice coming out strained, barely steady. "I'm at marker 6 on the North Trail. There's something out here." There's a crackle of static, then a response. "Copy that, Wilkins. Can you describe it?" I open my mouth to speak, but hesitate, my eyes still locked on the shadowy figure. It's not moving, just watching. My flashlight catches the faint outline of broad shoulders and what looks like patches of fur. "It's big," I finally manage, my voice shaky. "Not sure what it is. Might be a bear, but I don't think so." "Backup's on the way. Hold your position," the voice on the other end says, though there's a hint of confusion there. They must think I'm imagining things, spooked by some wildlife in the dark. I release the button and swallow hard. Backup's at least 10 minutes out. I don't know if I have that long. I take a cautious step back, keeping the flashlight aimed at the creature. It remains still, just a towering silhouette in the growing darkness. Then it shifts, steps to the side. The movement is smooth, almost fluid, and for a split second I catch a glimpse of its face. Or at least, I think it's a face. It's too obscured by shadows to make out any details, but there's a glint of something reflective, eyes maybe, staring back at me. I take another step back, and then another. My heart is pounding so hard I can hear the blood rushing in my ears. "Stay calm," I whisper to myself, feeling the panic clawing at my throat. "Just get back to the truck." The truck is parked a good half-mile down the trail. I know the path well, but right now it feels like a labyrinth. Every rustle, every snap of a twig makes me jump. I force myself to keep moving, slow and steady, never turning my back on the creature, but it's moving too. I see it out of the corner of my eye, gliding between the trees, its outline barely visible but unmistakably there. My foot catches on a root, and I stumble, the flashlight beam jerking wildly as I struggle to regain my balance. That's when I hear it, a low, guttural growl, deep and rumbling like thunder. It vibrates through the air, through me, and I feel my stomach drop. I don't dare look back. I break into a run, all pretense of calm shattering as the growl rises into a snarl. The forest blurs around me, branches whipping at my face, underbrush snagging at my legs. I hear it crashing through the forest behind me, heavy footfalls thudding against the ground, closer and closer. I'm gasping for breath, lungs burning, but I don't slow down. I can't. My truck is my only chance. There, up ahead, I see the glint of the truck's metallic frame in the flashlight's beam. Relief surges through me, but it's short-lived. I reach the vehicle and slam into the side, fumbling for the door handle. My hands are shaking so badly that it takes 2 tries before I manage to wrench the door open. I throw myself inside, slam the door shut, and lock it. Silence. My own ragged breathing fills the cab as I sit there, gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. For a moment I think I might be safe, but then I hear it, a heavy thud against the side of the truck, followed by the screech of metal being scratched, almost torn. I whip my head around and see a large, clawed hand dragging down the driver's side window. It's massive, the fingers tipped with black, hooked claws that carve deep gouges into the metal. My heart hammers in my chest as I scramble for the keys, shoving them into the ignition. The engine roars to life, and I jam my foot down on the accelerator. The truck lurches forward, tires spinning in the dirt before finally catching. I glance in the rearview mirror and catch a glimpse of it, tall, hulking, standing in the trail behind me, its eyes glinting in the red glow of the taillights. It doesn't chase after me, just watches as I speed away, tearing down the trail back toward the ranger station. I don't stop until I reach the station, my nerves so frayed I nearly crash into the parking barrier. I jump out of the truck, heart still pounding, and rush inside. My colleague, Pete, looks up from his desk, eyes wide as he takes in my disheveled state. "What the hell happened?" he asks, getting up quickly. "There's something out there," I gasp, leaning against the wall for support. "It's huge! It scratched the truck!" Pete's already moving, grabbing a flashlight and his radio. "Show me," he says, heading toward the door. I follow him outside, pointing to the truck, my breath still coming in shaky bursts. He shines his flashlight over the side of the vehicle, and I hear him suck in a breath. Deep gouges run down the length of the door, metal twisted and peeled back like it's been attacked by some giant animal. But more unsettling are the marks themselves. They're too clean, too deliberate, not the erratic scratching of a bear or any animal we know. "What did you see?" Pete asks, his voice a mix of concern and disbelief. I struggle to find the right words. "It was tall. Covered in fur, I think, standing on 2 legs. It had eyes, reflective eyes like an animal, but it felt wrong, like it was watching me, studying me." He gives me a long, hard look, then turns back to the truck. "We're gonna need more than backup," he mutters, reaching for his radio. "Base, this is Ranger Station 1. We have a situation. Over." As Pete speaks, I find myself staring back down the dark trail, half expecting to see those eyes glowing in the distance. The night is silent again, but not peaceful. It's the kind of silence that presses in on you, makes you feel small, watched, hunted. I know what I saw out there, and deep down, I know it's still out there. Watching, waiting. The forest has secrets, ancient ones, and tonight I came face to face with one of them. I don't know what it is, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is that the spiral of stones was no random formation. It was a marker, a line crossed, and now that thing knows I've seen it. Story 18. I wake up to a noise that instantly raises every hair on my body. There's something outside my tent. At first, I try to dismiss it as the wind or a raccoon, but as I lie there, holding my breath and listening intently, I know it's not either. Whatever it is, it's big. I can hear it rustling through my gear, moving slowly and deliberately. My heart starts to race. I'm deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, and I'm alone. I curse myself for camping solo, for thinking I'd enjoy the solitude. It seemed like such a great idea yesterday, a break from work, from life, to just be out here with nature. I've done it before, plenty of times. But right now, in the pitch black of the forest, with the walls of my tent feeling too thin and fragile, I'm starting to regret every single decision that led to this moment. The sound of heavy footsteps crunches outside, slow and methodical. I glance at my watch. It's 3:12 a.m., the kind of time when nightmares bleed into reality, when things happen that shouldn't. I lie there, heart pounding in my chest, gripping my flashlight in one hand. I want to look, need to know what's out there, but I'm paralyzed by fear. What if it's a bear? What if it's something worse? The footsteps stop directly outside my tent. I can hear the creature's heavy breathing, low and guttural. It's not a bear. It's something else, something bigger, something that doesn't belong out here. I force myself to move, inching my hand toward the zipper of the tent's door. Slowly, ever so slowly, I unzip it, just a crack, praying it doesn't make too much noise. The air outside is cold, biting against my face as I lean forward to peek through the small gap. I squint, trying to see through the darkness, but everything is shrouded in shadow. Then I spot it. There, just at the edge of the flashlight's faint beam, is a massive, hunched figure. It's rifling through my backpack, its movements eerily silent for something so large. My stomach knots up, and I feel a wave of nausea. The thing is covered in matted fur, thick and dark, almost blending into the night. It shifts slightly, and I catch a glimpse of what might be its head, long pointed ears and a snout that resembles a wolf's but far more grotesque, more monstrous. It's not a bear, and it's definitely not human. A werewolf, a dogman. My mind races, grasping for explanations that make sense of the impossible. As I stare, frozen with fear, it pauses and turns its head. For a horrifying moment, its glowing eyes lock onto mine through the tiny slit of the tent. My breath hitches, and I instinctively pull back, my heart hammering so loudly I'm sure it can hear it. It knows I'm here. There's a long, tense silence. I sit motionless, my fingers gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ache. I hear it sniffing the air, a deep, wet sound that sends chills down my spine. Then it starts moving closer. The ground beneath it crunches with each step, louder and heavier as it approaches the tent. I flick off my flashlight, plunging myself into darkness. Maybe if I stay quiet, it'll lose interest, but it doesn't. It stops just outside the thin nylon fabric, its breathing heavy, ragged, and far too close. A part of me wants to scream, to do something, anything, to scare it off, but my body won't obey. I hear it circling the tent, slow and deliberate, its claws dragging lightly against the ground. The sound is unnervingly sharp, like knives scraping against stone. It's testing the tent, pacing around it, considering. I press my hand to my mouth, trying to stifle the sound of my breathing. My mind is a chaotic swirl of terror and disbelief. What is this thing? The logical part of me screams to get up and run, but my legs are locked in place, paralyzed by sheer terror. I hear the creature stop near the front of the tent, right where I unzipped it just a sliver, and then the scratching starts. It's a slow, deliberate scratching against the fabric, the claws dragging down the tent's wall in a methodical pattern. I squeeze my eyes shut, as if by not seeing it, I can make it go away. But the scratching persists, a maddening, nerve-grating sound that seems to echo in the darkness. I can feel the tent trembling with each scrape, the fabric rippling like a drum skin under pressure. "Go away! Go away!" I whisper under my breath, barely audible even to myself, but there's no response. It scratches again, harder this time, as if testing the strength of the fabric, testing me. I glance at the knife lying by my side. A puny camping knife, laughable in the face of whatever is out there, but it's all I've got. I clutch it in my free hand, though I know it won't make a difference. The scratching suddenly stops, and an eerie silence falls over the campsite. I strain my ears, listening. I can still hear its breathing, heavy and ragged, but it's no longer moving. Is it waiting for me to make a move? Is it trying to lure me out? The minutes drag on, each second stretching into an eternity. My muscles are cramping from holding so still, but I don't dare move. I hear a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberates through the air and into my bones. The creature shifts, and I hear it move toward the zipper. My heart leaps into my throat as I realize it's trying to get in. I have to do something. Now. Without thinking, I grab the flashlight, flick it on, and point it directly at the creature through the tent's slit. For a split second, I see it clearly. Its face is twisted, almost wolf-like, but wrong. So wrong. Its eyes reflect the light, glowing with an unnatural, piercing yellow. Its lips curl back, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. It snarls, a deep, feral sound that makes my blood run cold. The tent shudders as it rakes its claws across the fabric, tearing a gash. My heart is pounding so hard I can barely hear anything else. I scramble backward, my mind screaming at me to get out, to run. In a panic, I lunge toward the back of the tent and yank at the zipper. The fabric tears in my hands as I push my way through, stumbling out into the frigid night air. I don't look back. I can't. I bolt for the tree line, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I run, breath coming in short, frantic gasps. Behind me, I hear the creature crashing through the campsite, its growls filling the forest. Branches whip at my face and arms as I sprint through the woods, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving, to not stop, no matter what. I dodge trees, leap over roots, my legs burning from the effort. I hear it behind me, closing the distance. Its heavy footfalls pounding the earth. It's faster than I am, and it's gaining. My lungs feel like they're on fire, but I push myself harder, veering off the trail and into the denser forest. The undergrowth scratches at my legs, and I nearly trip over a fallen log. Somehow, I keep my footing, fueled by sheer terror. I risk a glance over my shoulder and see it, a massive, hulking silhouette barreling toward me, eyes glowing in the dark. I know I can't outrun it. I can't escape. My eyes dart around wildly, searching for something, anything that could save me. Up ahead, I spot a large, fallen tree, its trunk split open to reveal a hollow interior. It's a slim chance, but it's all I've got. I dive toward it, throwing myself into the hollow space and curling up as small as I can. I shove my flashlight inside my jacket to muffle the light, holding my breath. The forest falls silent again, the only sound my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The creature stops outside, sniffing the air. I can hear it pacing back and forth, its claws scraping against the bark of the tree. I clench my eyes shut, praying it can't find me, that it'll move on, but it doesn't. It lets out a snarl, louder this time, a sound of frustration and anger. For what feels like hours, it circles the tree, occasionally scratching at the trunk, its breathing heavy and labored. I lie there, trembling, waiting for it to reach in and drag me out. But it doesn't. Slowly, grudgingly, it seems to lose interest. I hear it step away, the crunch of leaves growing fainter as it retreats into the forest. I don't move. I stay curled up in that hollow log for what feels like an eternity, listening to every rustle, every snap of a twig. Finally, when the sky starts to lighten with the first hint of dawn, I crawl out, shaking uncontrollably. I stumble back to my campsite, dreading what I might find. My tent is shredded, my gear scattered everywhere. The ground is torn up, marked with deep, clawed footprints. I don't take anything. I don't even pack up. I just start walking, and I don't stop until I reach my car, the sun rising behind me. As I drive away, I glance in the rearview mirror at the woods, now bathed in morning light. It looks peaceful, serene, as if nothing had happened. But I know better. There's something out there, something that doesn't belong, and it watched me that night. I'll never camp alone again. Story 19. The valley is wrong. I can't put my finger on it at first, but something is off, like the air itself is holding its breath. My friend Mike and I have been hiking this remote trail for most of the day, deep in the wilderness where few people ever venture, and it's been peaceful up until now. But as we crest a small ridge and descend into this hidden valley, the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. This place feels dead. "Hey, check this out," Mike calls out, pointing to something on the ground. I approach, my boots crunching over dry, brittle leaves, and immediately see what he's staring at. Bones, scattered all over the valley floor, some bleached white from age, others looking disturbingly fresh. A deer's skull grins up at me from a pile of ribs and vertebrae. My stomach churns. "Jesus," I mutter, glancing around. There are bones everywhere, more than I've ever seen in one place. It's like some kind of graveyard, but what really sets me on edge is the fact that there are no scavenger marks, no signs of natural decay. It's like they've just been left here. Mike, oblivious to my growing unease, kneels to examine one of the fresher-looking bones. "This is weird, man. I mean, why would there be so many—" The forest suddenly goes silent. I mean dead silent. No birds. No rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. My heart skips a beat as I look around, the feeling of wrongness intensifying. I grip the straps of my backpack, my mouth dry. "We need to get out of here," I say, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike glances up at me, confusion on his face. "Why? It's just some bones." "No, it's not just the bones. It's this whole place." "Something's not right," I snap, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. I scan the tree line, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows, but there's nothing, just that eerie, unnatural stillness. Mike frowns but stands up, brushing the dirt off his knees. All right. If it freaks you out that much, we'll go." We turn and start making our way back up the ridge, my nerves screaming at me to move faster, to get out of this place. But the climb is steep, and the loose dirt and rocks slow our progress. As we hike, I keep glancing over my shoulder, a sick feeling growing in my gut. I don't know what I'm expecting to see, but every instinct I have is telling me that we're not alone. Then I hear it, a faint rustling from behind us, from the valley floor. I freeze mid-step, grabbing Mike's arm. "Did you hear that?" He stops, listening. "Hear what?" I open my mouth to reply, but the sound comes again, louder this time. It's like the sound of dry leaves and twigs being crushed underfoot, a slow, deliberate crunching. My heart leaps into my throat. I turn, scanning the valley below us, and that's when I see it. A shadowy figure, partially hidden in the underbrush. It's large, much larger than any animal I've ever seen, and it's moving toward us. At first, I think it might be a bear, but then it straightens, standing upright. My breath catches in my throat as I realize that this thing, whatever it is, isn't walking on all fours. It's on two legs. "Run!" I whisper, my voice barely audible. Then louder, more urgent, "Run!" Mike turns, sees the thing, and his eyes go wide with fear. We both break into a sprint, scrambling up the ridge, rocks and dirt sliding out from under our boots. I hear that crunching sound again, louder, faster. It's following us. "Don't look back!" I shout, my legs burning as I push myself harder than I ever have before. The trail is treacherous, filled with roots and loose stones that threaten to trip us up. My lungs feel like they're on fire, but I can't slow down. I won't slow down, not with that thing behind us. But Mike does look back. I hear his sharp intake of breath, followed by a choked cry. "It's getting closer," he yells, his voice cracking with terror. I risk a glance over my shoulder and immediately wish I hadn't. The creature is climbing the ridge with terrifying speed. It's massive, covered in dark, matted fur, its limbs long and gangly yet horrifyingly powerful. Its face is a blur, hidden in shadow, but I catch a glimpse of eyes, dark, soulless, reflecting just enough light to make my blood run cold. My foot catches on a root, and I stumble, nearly pitching forward onto my face. I catch myself just in time, gasping for breath. Mike is right beside me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "We're not gonna make it," he gasps. "Keep moving," I shout, half dragging him forward. "We're almost at the top of the ridge. If we can just make it to the other side, maybe we can find some cover, some place to hide." The crunching footsteps behind us are getting louder, more frenzied. I can hear the creature's ragged breathing, a guttural, almost growling sound that sends waves of fear crashing over me. We reach the top of the ridge, and I nearly collapse with relief. There, just ahead, is a cluster of thick trees. "This way!" I shout, yanking Mike toward the trees. We dive into the undergrowth, pushing through the branches, the foliage clawing at our clothes and skin. I keep moving, half blind with panic, my only thought to put as much distance between us and that thing as possible. We finally come to a small clearing, surrounded by dense, ancient trees. I collapse against a trunk, gasping for air, my entire body trembling. Mike drops beside me, his eyes wide and staring, his chest heaving. "Did we lose it?" he pants, looking back the way we came. I don't know," I manage to say between gulps of air. I strain my ears, listening for any sound of pursuit. But all I hear is the thudding of my own heartbeat, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The forest has returned to its unsettling quiet. Minutes pass, each one feeling like an eternity. My breathing starts to slow, but my nerves are still on edge, every instinct screaming at me to stay alert. I peek around the tree, scanning the undergrowth for any sign of movement. Nothing. Maybe we lost it. Mike shifts beside me, wiping sweat from his brow. "What the hell was that?" he whispers, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I reply, my eyes still darting around the clearing. "But it's not something we want to meet again." Just as I start to feel a sliver of hope that we might be safe, a twig snaps in the brush nearby. My blood runs cold. I turn slowly, and there it is, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. It's closer now, and I can see it more clearly. Its body is tall and gaunt, covered in dark, tangled fur that hangs off it in clumps. Its limbs are long, almost unnaturally so, ending in hands that resemble twisted, clawed fingers. And its face, oh God, its face. It's like a distorted, nightmarish version of a wolf's, with hollow eyes that seem to bore straight through me. It steps forward, and I instinctively grab Mike's arm, pulling him back. "Run!" I hiss. Though I know there's nowhere left to go, we're cornered. The creature tilts its head, watching us, almost as if it's amused by our fear. My legs feel like lead, but I force myself to move, yanking Mike toward the other side of the clearing. But as we start to run, the creature lets out a low, rumbling growl that freezes us in our tracks. It moves, quick as a flash, cutting off our escape route. We stumble back, pressing ourselves against a tree, our hearts pounding. The creature stands there, watching us with those hollow eyes, its body shifting and swaying as if deciding what to do next. I clutch at the knife strapped to my belt, though I know it's a pitiful defense against something like this. For a moment, everything is still. The forest around us, the air itself, seems to hold its breath. The creature steps forward, and I feel a surge of terror so intense I can hardly think. But then, abruptly, it stops. It turns its head sharply, as if hearing something we can't. And then, in a blur of movement, it retreats back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. The silence that follows is deafening. I collapse to the ground, my legs giving out beneath me, gasping for breath. Mike sinks down beside me, his eyes wide, his face pale as a ghost. "What just happened?" he chokes out. I don't know," I stammer, shaking uncontrollably. "But we need to get out of here now." We don't waste another second. We scramble to our feet and take off, heading back the way we came, our only thought to get as far away from this place as possible. As we run, I can't shake the feeling that we're being watched, that somewhere in the depths of the forest, those hollow eyes are still following us. We finally make it back to the main trail and keep running until we reach the edge of the forest and the safety of our car. We collapse inside, slamming the door shut, gasping for breath, our minds reeling from what just happened. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see that dark, hulking figure standing there. But there's nothing, just the empty, silent woods. We drive away, leaving that cursed valley far behind. But even as we put miles between us and the forest, I can't shake the image of those bones, scattered like a grim warning. And those eyes, I know I'll see them again, every time I close my eyes. Story 20. The scream pierced the night like a blade through the dark, jolting me awake in an instant. My heart raced as I sat upright in my sleeping bag, ears straining to make sense of what I had just heard. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then it came again, a horrible, bone-chilling wail that echoed through the forest, lingering in the air like a fog of dread. It wasn't an animal. It sounded almost human, but twisted, warped into something utterly unrecognizable. I glanced around the campsite, where my friends were already stirring, eyes wide and faces pale. Ryan, the most experienced camper among us, was sitting up, his head cocked slightly to the side, as if listening. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I knew he had. "Yeah," he muttered, his eyes scanning the tree line, searching for any hint of movement. "It sounded close." The word settled in the pit of my stomach like a stone. We were deep in the woods, far from civilization, surrounded by miles of unbroken wilderness. Nothing should have been out here except for deer, raccoons, maybe the occasional bear. But that scream, nothing natural made a sound like that. "What the hell was that?" Jess hissed, her voice barely more than a shaky breath. She sat huddled in her sleeping bag, flashlight clenched in her hands. "Probably an animal," Ryan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Mountain lions can make some pretty unsettling noises." "That wasn't a mountain lion," I said, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep calm. I had heard mountain lions before, and they didn't scream like that. That sound was wrong. For a while, we sat there in the darkness, tense and silent, listening. The forest around us seemed unnaturally quiet, as if every creature had gone into hiding. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, every muscle in my body on high alert. My eyes flicked back and forth across the campsite, searching the shadows for anything that moved. But there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. "Maybe we should go back to sleep," Ryan suggested, though his tone was more hopeful than confident. "It's probably nothing," I nodded, more out of a desire to pretend everything was fine than because I believed him. We all lay back down, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. I stared up at the tent ceiling, my senses on high alert, waiting, expecting, and then it came again, louder this time, closer. A shrill, ear-splitting shriek that sent a jolt of terror straight through my chest. I shot upright, scrambling out of my sleeping bag. The others were already up, their faces pale in the moonlight filtering through the thin fabric of the tent. "Holy shit!" Alex gasped, fumbling with his flashlight as he pointed it toward the tent's entrance. "What is that?" "Quiet," Ryan hissed, motioning for us to stay low. He slowly unzipped the tent door, just enough to peek outside. I held my breath, my heart thundering in my chest as he scanned the campsite with his flashlight. The beam swept over trees, bushes, and the fire pit where the embers still glowed faintly. Nothing, but the silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. A rustle sounded from the underbrush, followed by a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Ryan pulled his head back into the tent, his eyes wide. "Something's out there," he whispered. "It's circling us." My stomach twisted into a knot, circling us. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. What kind of animal circles a campsite, and what was making those screams? We huddled together, barely daring to breathe, the thin nylon walls of the tent feeling like a pitiful barrier between us and whatever was out there. I listened, every muscle tense, as the growling grew louder, then softer, moving around us in a slow, deliberate pattern. Whatever it was taking its time, playing with us. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the growling stopped. The silence returned, even heavier than before, pressing down on us like a thick, suffocating blanket. I exchanged a glance with Jess, her eyes wide with fear, reflecting my own. My skin prickled with a deep sense of dread, an instinctual feeling that we were being hunted. Minutes dragged by like hours. We sat in the dark, flashlights in hand, staring at the tent's entrance. I could hear the others breathing, shallow and quick, matching my own. And then, from somewhere in the woods, came a new sound, a low, rumbling snarl, deep and guttural, that made my blood run cold. It wasn't close, but it was coming closer, slowly, deliberately. "What do we do?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. Ryan swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the tent door. "We wait. If it comes for us, we make a lot of noise. Most animals will get scared off if you shout and make yourself look bigger." "Most animals," I echoed, the implication hanging in the air. What if this wasn't an animal? What if it was something else, something that didn't scare easily? We sat there listening as the sound moved through the forest. I strained my ears, trying to pinpoint its location. It seemed to be moving erratically, circling around, doubling back, as if it was toying with us. The screams had stopped, replaced by that low, menacing growl that made my skin crawl. Then, without warning, the tent wall shuddered. I stifled a scream as something large brushed against it, moving past us with a rustling sound. My heart leapt into my throat. It was right there, just inches away. I could hear it breathing, a harsh, ragged panting that sent chills down my spine. The tent fabric rippled again, and I saw a faint outline of a hand, or maybe a paw, pressing against it. It was huge, too large for any animal I could think of, with long, sharp-looking claws that dragged down the nylon with a slow, deliberate motion. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached, ready to swing at anything that tried to come through. For a terrifying moment, it paused, pressing harder against the fabric, as if testing it. Then, slowly, it began to move away. The sound of its footsteps receding into the forest. My body sagged with relief, though my heart continued to race. "What the hell was that?" Jess whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I don't know," Ryan admitted, his face pale in the dim light, "but we need to get out of here." We nodded in agreement, quickly gathering what little we could carry. The plan was simple. Make a run for the car, which was parked about half a mile away on the other side of the forest clearing. It wasn't much, but it was the only plan we had. With trembling hands, Ryan unzipped the tent door. We crawled out into the cold, moonlit night, our flashlights casting long, wavering beams across the campsite. The forest loomed around us, dark and silent, as if waiting for us to make our move. "Stay close," Ryan whispered, "and don't look back." We started to walk, moving slowly and deliberately, every step feeling like it might be our last. I scanned the tree line, my nerves on edge, half expecting to see something lunge out at us. But nothing moved. The forest remained unnervingly still, the quiet stretching out, taut and brittle like a wire ready to snap. Then, from somewhere off to our right, came that scream again, louder, angrier. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced toward the sound, catching a glimpse of movement between the trees, something large and hunched, with glowing eyes that reflected the light from our flashlights. "Run!" Ryan shouted, breaking into a sprint. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we ran. I could hear the creature behind us, its footsteps pounding the ground, closing in fast. Branches whipped at my face, tearing at my clothes as I pushed forward, my lungs burning with every breath. I could hear Jess screaming, but I didn't dare look back. The car was our only chance. I had to reach it. We had to reach it. The tree line broke, and I saw the car up ahead, glinting in the moonlight. "Hurry!" I shouted, my voice raw with fear. We stumbled across the clearing, the creature's growls echoing behind us. So close, I could almost feel its hot, foul breath on my neck. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. The others piled in, slamming the doors shut, just as something massive crashed against the side of the vehicle. "Go, go, go!" Jess screamed. Ryan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly it took him 2 tries before he managed to start the engine. The car roared to life, and we sped off, gravel spraying up behind us as we tore down the dirt road. I looked back, my breath hitching in my throat as I caught one last glimpse of it in the rearview mirror. A hulking, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes glowing in the darkness, watching us as we fled. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away from the forest. Even then, the screams echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder of whatever was out there. We never talked about it again, each of us silently agreeing that some things were better left forgotten. But I know, deep down, that those screams were a warning. A reminder that some places in the world are not meant to be visited, not meant to be disturbed, and that whatever we encountered that night is still out there, waiting. Story 21. The howl cut through the stillness of the forest, a deep, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. I froze, my rifle halfway to my shoulder, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I stood there, the forest around me unnervingly quiet, every instinct screaming that I was not alone. I had been out here hunting for hours, trekking deep into this remote stretch of woods where few dared to go, but I had never heard a sound like that. It wasn't a wolf, nor any animal I knew. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I glanced around, scanning the tree line with the butt of my rifle pressed against my shoulder. Nothing moved. The trees stretched high above me, their branches swaying gently in the light wind, casting long shadows across the forest floor. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. It was probably just a coyote. I tried to convince myself, even though I knew better. The howl came again, louder this time, echoing through the trees like a warning. I gripped the rifle tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I had hunted in these woods all my life, knew every trail, every hidden clearing, but right now I felt like a stranger. The sound wasn't just unnerving, it was wrong, deep, mournful and angry all at once, like something that was both calling and threatening. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves, and kept moving. I needed to get back to my truck. I had wandered further than I meant to, and now the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the forest in a dim, bluish light. The air grew colder with every passing minute, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift, taking on shapes that made my heart skip, crunch. I froze, every muscle tensing. That noise hadn't come from me. I stood there, holding my breath, listening. There it was again, a faint rustle, the snapping of a twig. Something was moving through the underbrush, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't far off. My mouth went dry as I raised the rifle, pointing it in the direction of the sound. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the quiet woods. No response, just the soft rustling of leaves, my heart hammered against my ribs, my mind racing with possibilities. It could be a bear. I'd run into those out here before, but bears didn't howl like that. A shape moved between the trees, a hulking shadow that made my breath hitch in my throat. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was tall, too tall, and it moved with an unsettling grace, slipping between the trunks as if it were gliding. I gripped the rifle tighter, my pulse quickening. Whatever it wasn't a bear. "Show yourself," I shouted, though my voice shook. The shape paused, then slowly turned. My heart stuttered as I caught a glimpse of it. It was covered in dark, matted fur, standing upright on 2 legs, but it wasn't a man. Its shoulders were too broad, its limbs too long, and its face, I couldn't make out its face, just the glint of 2 eyes reflecting the dying light. A low, rumbling growl filled the air, vibrating through my chest. I took a step back, my finger hovering over the trigger. The creature didn't move, just stared, its eyes locked onto mine. They glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, like burning coals smoldering in the darkness. It wasn't just looking at me, it was studying me. Fear surged through me, nearly paralyzing. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get out of here, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I tried to speak, but the words died in my throat. I was a hunter, used to being the predator, but now, standing there in front of this thing, I felt like prey. The creature let out a deep, throaty snarl, and in that instant, I knew it was about to charge. Without thinking, I raised the rifle and fired. The crack of the gunshot shattered the stillness, echoing through the forest like a thunderclap. The creature recoiled, letting out an enraged roar that made my ears ring. I didn't wait to see if I hit it. I turned and ran, adrenaline pumping through my veins, fear driving my legs faster than they had ever moved before. Branches whipped at my face, roots snagged at my boots. But I didn't stop. The truck was a mile away, maybe more, but it felt like an impossible distance with the thing behind me. I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, a heavy, rhythmic pounding that matched the frantic beat of my heart. It was close, too close. I glanced back over my shoulder and nearly stumbled at what I saw. The creature was bounding after me on all fours, its eyes glowing fiercely in the dim light, its massive form moving with terrifying speed and power. Panic surged through me, giving me a burst of energy. I pushed harder, leaping over a fallen log and ducking under a low-hanging branch. I had to get to the truck. It was my only chance. I could hear it gaining on me, its growls growing louder, a mix of fury and hunger that chilled me to the bone. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for rest, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. My vision tunneled as I focused on the path ahead, the narrow trail that would lead me back to the clearing where I'd parked. The forest blurred around me, a chaotic swirl of green and brown, the shadows dancing at the edges of my vision. Then up ahead I saw it, the glint of metal through the trees. The truck, relief surged through me, almost making me dizzy. I was so close. I dug deep, forcing my legs to keep moving, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I could hear the creature right behind me, its growls morphing into something almost like laughter, a cruel, mocking sound that filled me with dread. I burst into the clearing, the truck just a few yards away. I lunged for it, reaching out to grab the handle, but my foot caught on a root. I stumbled, crashing to the ground with a grunt. Pain shot through my knee, but I scrambled up, adrenaline masking the worst of it. I didn't dare look back. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a split second, there was silence. I sat there, gasping for breath, hands trembling as I fumbled to lock the doors. Then a deafening crash as the creature slammed into the side of the truck. The whole vehicle rocked with the impact, and I screamed, my heart leaping into my throat. I grabbed the keys, jamming them into the ignition, my fingers slick with sweat. The engine roared to life, and I stomped on the gas. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the dirt before finally catching traction. I sped down the rough trail, the creature's snarls fading behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. And there, in the distance, I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me. It was massive, its hunched form illuminated by the truck's taillights. It didn't chase me, just stood there, its eyes glowing like twin embers in the darkness. I felt a shudder run through me as I met its gaze, a gaze that promised this wasn't over. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with what I had just encountered. I pulled over to the shoulder, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stared straight ahead, my body trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. What was that thing? My rational mind grasped for answers. A bear, a wolf, but none fit. This creature, this thing that had hunted me, was something else. Something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. I had fired at it point blank, and it had barely flinched. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to steady my breathing, trying to process. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, a refuge from the chaos of the world. But now it felt like a place of danger, a realm where something monstrous lurked in the shadows, waiting. I looked back toward the forest, now just a dark mass against the night sky. It seemed to pulse with an unseen life, a presence that made my skin crawl. I didn't know if I could ever set foot in those woods again. I had always considered myself the hunter, the one in control. But tonight, I had learned the truth. Out there in the depths of the forest, I was the prey, and something was still watching, still waiting for its chance to hunt again. Story 22. The storm hit faster than I could have imagined, turning the late afternoon sky into a dark, churning mess of wind and rain. My friend Sam and I had been hiking a remote trail, far from any established campsite, when the first fat drops started pelting the ground. Within minutes, it transformed into a torrential downpour, the kind that soaks you to the bone in seconds. We ran, slipping and stumbling along the muddy path, trying to find some kind of shelter before we were completely drenched. And that's when we saw it, the cabin standing at the edge of a clearing, half hidden by the undergrowth. It was old, maybe 100 years or more, with its wooden walls covered in moss and vines. The windows were grimy, like eyes clouded with cataracts, and the roof sagged slightly, but it looked solid enough to offer us some protection from the storm. "We need to get inside," Sam shouted over the roar of the wind. I nodded, squinting against the driving rain as we sprinted toward it. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, but it swung open easily enough with a creak that set my nerves on edge. We stumbled inside, shaking off water and mud, grateful to be out of the elements. The interior was dark, musty, and cold, the air thick with the scent of decay and damp wood. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam sweeping across a small, single-room space. There was a table in the center, a few broken chairs, and what looked like an old rusted stove in one corner. The walls were scarred, gouged with deep marks that made my skin prickle. Sam glanced around, his brow furrowing. "What the hell happened in here?" I shook my head, feeling a chill crawl up my spine despite the warmth of the flashlight in my hand. The claw marks, or were they scratches, covered almost every surface, some deep enough to have splintered the wood. I stepped closer to one of the walls, running my fingers over the grooves. They were jagged, uneven, as if something had desperately tried to get out, or maybe something had tried to get in. "Looks like a bear or something," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I had seen bear scratches before, and these were different, longer, sharper, more deliberate almost. "Let's just wait out the storm," Sam said, pulling his jacket tighter around him as he slumped into one of the less broken chairs. "Once it clears up, we'll get moving." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that was creeping up my spine. The storm outside howled, the wind battering against the walls and rattling the old windows. It felt like the cabin was alive, groaning under the onslaught of nature. I sat down across from Sam, trying to calm my nerves. It was just a cabin, just a storm. We'd be fine. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. It was hard to tell in the gloom. The wind seemed to grow angrier, thrashing against the building, and a shiver ran through me as I realized just how isolated we were. I glanced at Sam, who was staring at the floor, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. He looked as uneasy as I felt. Then, a noise, a faint scratching sound coming from beneath the floor. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I shot a glance at Sam, who had also stiffened, his eyes wide as he looked at me. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, it's probably just an animal." Sam shook his head, his face going even paler. "That doesn't sound like an animal." The scratching continued, soft and rhythmic, almost like something was clawing at the wood from underneath. I aimed my flashlight at the floor, sweeping the beam over the dusty, rotting boards. There, near the far wall, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a trapdoor, partially obscured by debris and dirt. Its edges were frayed, and the wood was scarred with the same kind of gouges that marred the walls. "There's something under there," I breathed, taking a cautious step toward it. Sam shot to his feet, his eyes wide with fear. "Don't," he hissed. "We should just leave." But the storm was still raging outside, the rain pelting against the roof like a drumbeat. We couldn't go out there. Not yet. I shook my head, my curiosity tinged with dread. We need to know what it is. If there's an animal trapped down there, we can't just leave it. I crouched down, my hand hovering over the edge of the trapdoor. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like whatever was underneath knew we were there. My heart thudded in my chest as I steeled myself and yanked the trapdoor open. A blast of cold, stale air hit me in the face, carrying with it a stench of rot and decay. I gagged, waving a hand in front of my nose as I shone the flashlight into the dark space below. The beam revealed a narrow, dirt-floored cellar, the walls lined with more claw marks. At the far end, I caught a glimpse of something moving, something large and hunched over. My breath caught in my throat as two eyes reflected the light back at me, glowing with an unnatural, predatory gleam. The thing in the cellar let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated up through the floorboards and into my bones. It shifted, crawling closer, and I caught a glimpse of long, tangled limbs and matted fur, a body that was far too big for the small space it was crammed into. "Close it!" Sam screamed, his voice breaking through my stunned paralysis. I slammed the trapdoor shut, my hands trembling as I scrambled to latch it, but the thing beneath was already pushing against it, the wood creaking and bowing under the strain. "Help me!" I shouted, and Sam rushed over, throwing his weight onto the trapdoor just as something slammed into it from below. The impact jarred my teeth, and I felt the vibration in my bones. The creature let out a shriek, a high-pitched wail that filled the cabin, making my ears ring. The floorboards groaned, cracking under the pressure of the thing's relentless assault. I could feel the trapdoor buckling beneath us, the hinges straining against the force. "We have to get out of here," I yelled, adrenaline surging through me. Sam nodded frantically, and we both leapt to our feet, stumbling toward the door. Another crash from below sent splinters flying as the trapdoor shattered, a clawed hand, no, a paw, thrusting up through the gap, grasping at the air with fingers tipped in wickedly sharp talons. I threw open the cabin door, the wind and rain slamming into us as we burst out into the clearing. We ran, the storm whipping around us, the ground turning to slippery mud under our boots. Behind us, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. The splintering of wood, followed by a heavy thud as something large hauled itself out of the cellar. I glanced back, and in the brief flash of lightning I saw it, a hulking fur-covered figure, dragging itself through the doorway of the cabin. Its limbs were too long, too twisted, its face a distorted mask of fangs and wild eyes that glinted in the storm's light. It let out a roar, a sound of fury and hunger as it lumbered after us. "Run!" I screamed, pushing myself harder, my legs burning with every step. Sam was just ahead of me, slipping and stumbling through the undergrowth, the rain blinding us both. I could hear the creature crashing through the brush behind us, gaining ground with every second. It was fast, far faster than anything that size had any right to be. The woods blurred around me, a chaotic mix of branches and shadows. I could feel the thing's presence, its malice, like a tangible force pushing against my back. We had to make it to the road, to the car. That was our only chance. Then, as if by some miracle, the trees opened up, and I saw the glint of the car's metal in the distance. I surged forward, heart pounding in my chest, lungs burning. Sam reached the car first, fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the door open. "Get in!" he yelled, and I dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door behind me. He twisted the key, the engine sputtering to life just as the creature burst out of the tree line. Its eyes locked onto us with a murderous glare. Sam floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, tires spinning in the mud before finally catching traction. We sped down the narrow dirt road, the creature's roar fading behind us, though its image burned into my mind, the twisted limbs, the matted fur, those eyes filled with rage. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, the storm finally beginning to let up. I sat there, gasping for breath, staring out the windshield at the empty road ahead. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the horror of what we had seen hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Finally, Sam broke the silence, his voice trembling. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head, unable to form the words. I didn't know. All I knew was that we had come across something ancient, something that had been trapped for a long time in that cellar, and now it was free. The abandoned cabin was just a memory in the rearview mirror, but I knew I would never forget the sound of those claws on the wood, or the eyes staring up at me from the darkness. Whatever was in that forest, it was out there now, and it was hunting. Story 23. The figure stood there, partially obscured by the underbrush, and every instinct I had screamed to turn back. It was dusk, and the forest around me had grown quiet, the chirping of birds and rustling of leaves fading into an unnatural stillness. My flashlight's beam wavered in the gathering darkness, its weak light barely cutting through the dense thicket of trees ahead. There, on the trail, was something, someone, just standing, watching me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I'd been a park ranger for 5 years, and in all that time, I'd never felt anything like this. My hand tightened around the flashlight, and I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello, are you lost?" The words sounded thin, swallowed up by the trees around me. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It was just a dark shape, a shadow in the gathering gloom. I took a cautious step forward, squinting to see if I could make out more details. It wasn't until I was about 20 feet away that I realized how big it was. My heart skipped a beat. It was tall, much taller than any person should be, and its shoulders were unnaturally broad, hunched forward like it was barely containing its own size. My stomach tightened with a sick dread. "Hey!" I shouted again, more forcefully this time, though fear twisted my insides. "This is a restricted area. You need to turn back now." Still nothing. No movement, no sound, just the dark, hulking shape standing on the trail, staring. I could feel the weight of its gaze, though I couldn't make out any eyes or features in the dim light. I took another step forward, lifting my flashlight higher, trying to pierce the darkness that seemed to cling to it like a shroud, and then it moved, not towards me, but to the side, sliding into the thicker underbrush with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. It was almost as if it glided rather than walked. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. Should I follow? Every rational part of me screamed no, but I couldn't just leave it there. What if it was a person in need of help, someone lost, maybe injured? I forced my legs to move, stepping off the trail and into the dense foliage. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath my boots, every sound amplified in the silence of the forest. I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching for any sign of the figure, but the forest was closing in around me, the trees crowding together as if to block my path. "Hello!" I called out again, my voice sounding small and hollow. I pushed through a thicket of branches, the leaves scraping against my face and hands. The beam of my flashlight jittered in front of me, casting strange, warped shadows across the ground. There was a sudden rustle to my left, a quick, sharp sound that made me jump. I spun around, shining the light toward the noise, but there was nothing there, just trees and undergrowth. My mouth went dry, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was watching me from the darkness just beyond the reach of my light. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to turn around to get back to the safety of the trail. But before I could, I heard a low, guttural growl, a sound so deep it vibrated in my bones. I whipped the flashlight toward the source, and there it was, the figure, standing just inside the tree line. It was closer now, much closer, and I could finally see some details. It wasn't human. It was hunched and covered in thick, matted fur, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural ways. My breath caught in my throat as I caught a glimpse of its face, or what I thought was its face. It was a grotesque blend of man and beast, eyes glinting with a predatory light, a mouth lined with teeth too sharp, too numerous. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam wobbling as I tried to keep it trained on the creature. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those glinting eyes. A primal fear surged through me, and I turned, crashing through the underbrush in a desperate attempt to reach the trail. My lungs burned as I ran, my feet slipping on the uneven ground. Branches snagged at my clothes, tore at my skin, but I didn't care. I had to get out of there. I could hear it behind me, a series of heavy, thudding footfalls that matched my pace. It was following me, stalking me, and I didn't dare look back. I broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the trail, nearly losing my balance. I turned sharply, shining my flashlight back toward the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Nothing. The forest was still, silent. My ears strained for any sound, any indication that it was still there, but all I heard was the pounding of my own heart. I stood there, chest heaving, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My mind raced. What was that thing? My rational side tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a shadow, maybe even a bear standing on its hind legs. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Bears didn't look like that. Nothing I knew looked like that. I took a shaky breath, glancing up and down the trail. I needed to get back to my truck, get help, report this, whatever this was. I turned and started walking quickly, almost jogging, the beam of the flashlight bobbing in front of me. The trail stretched ahead, twisting through the trees, and I forced myself to keep moving, to focus on the path and not the shadows pressing in from either side. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure lurching out of the darkness behind me, but the trail remained empty. The forest around me was eerily quiet, the usual night sounds of insects and rustling leaves, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Then I heard it again, the growl, low, resonant, and far too close. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping over the trail, the trees. There, just at the edge of the light's reach, the figure emerged from the shadows. It moved toward me, slow and deliberate, its eyes fixed on mine. Panic surged through me, and I raised the rifle that hung at my side. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice wavered. I aimed at the creature, my finger on the trigger, but it kept coming, undeterred. My mind raced, fear clouding my thoughts. I had to do something, had to stop it. With a shaky breath, I fired. The shot rang out, a deafening crack that shattered the silence of the forest. The creature recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl that made my blood run cold. I didn't wait to see if I had hit it. I turned and ran, sprinting down the trail as fast as my legs could carry me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I pushed forward, the adrenaline surging through me, driving me on. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the forest, matching my pace. I glanced back, and in the dim light I saw it, its eyes glowing, its twisted form loping through the trees with an unnatural, terrifying speed. The trail curved, and up ahead I saw the faint glint of metal. My truck. Relief flooded me, giving me a burst of energy. I stumbled toward it, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. For a moment, I just sat there, clutching the wheel, staring out into the darkness. I could hear my own heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat in the quiet of the truck's cab. Slowly, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I flicked on the headlights. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the trail ahead. And there, standing just at the edge of the light, was the creature. It watched me, its eyes gleaming, its body hunched and distorted, a grotesque silhouette against the night. I felt a shiver run through me as it tilted its head, almost as if it were mocking me. I slammed the truck into reverse, my hands shaking on the wheel. The creature didn't move, just stood there, watching as I backed up and turned around, speeding away down the narrow dirt road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a second I thought I saw it move, slinking back into the shadows of the forest. I drove, my heart pounding, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. All I knew was that the forest had eyes tonight, cold, watchful eyes that had followed me every step of the way, and as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Story 24. The noise woke me up just past midnight, a low, deep sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the forest floor. I sat up in my tent, heart pounding, straining my ears to hear over the pounding of my blood. I wasn't new to camping alone in the woods, but something about this sound chilled me to the bone. I froze, gripping my flashlight, feeling every inch of the darkness pressing in around me. The noise was coming from somewhere near my tent, too close for comfort. I inched forward, unzipping the tent as quietly as possible. Cold air rushed in, and I poked my head out just enough to peer into the darkness. The forest was still, the trees standing like sentinels under the pale glow of the moon. My breath clouded in front of me as I scanned the surroundings, searching for whatever was making that noise. And then I saw it. A massive, gnarled tree a few yards away. It looked ancient, its bark thick and twisted, almost grotesque in the moonlight. It wasn't the tree itself that caught my attention, though. It was the hollow cavity in its trunk. The darkness inside that hollow seemed to stretch deeper than the tree could possibly go, and from within I heard it again, the dragging, scratching noise, like something was moving around in there. I swallowed hard, adrenaline making my skin prickle. It was probably just an animal, a raccoon or a porcupine, maybe. But as I watched, I saw something move inside the hollow, a shadow, a sliver of darkness shifting against the black interior. My breath hitched. That wasn't a raccoon. I pulled my head back into the tent and sat there, gripping my flashlight, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to curl back up in my sleeping bag and pretend I'd seen nothing, wait for morning to break. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, demanded that I investigate. I had to know what was inside that tree. Gathering every ounce of courage, I slipped out of the tent and stood in the cold night air, my breath hanging in puffs. I clicked on the flashlight and aimed it at the tree. The beam was bright, slicing through the darkness, but when it hit the hollow, the light seemed to get swallowed up. I couldn't see the back of the hollow. It was like the tree went on forever. I took a cautious step toward it, then another, the forest floor crunching under my boots. The sound from within the hollow grew louder, more frantic, a rhythmic scratching that made my skin crawl. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a trapped animal, something that had gotten itself stuck. I moved closer, holding my breath. When I was just a few feet away, I crouched down, aiming the flashlight directly into the hollow. The beam cut through the darkness, and I froze. Eyes. A pair of small, gleaming eyes stared back at me from deep within the tree. They were set low, almost at ground level, and they glowed faintly, reflecting the light like an animal's in the dark. But then something moved, and those eyes rose up, lifting higher and higher until they were at least 5 feet off the ground. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my ears. Whatever was in that hollow wasn't small, it wasn't an animal. It was something much larger, something that was now pushing its way toward me. I scrambled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I kept the flashlight trained on the tree. The thing inside began to emerge, slowly, with a kind of sickening grace. First came a hand. No, a claw. It was long and gnarled, like the roots of an old tree, but it ended in sharp, curved talons that gleamed in the light. It gripped the edge of the hollow, pulling itself out, followed by an arm, impossibly long and covered in rough, bark-like skin. My stomach twisted in horror as more of it emerged. The creature was tall, its body twisted and emaciated, covered in a texture that looked disturbingly like the tree bark itself. Its head was misshapen, elongated, with patches of matted fur and those same reflective eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. It let out a sound, a guttural, almost choking growl that reverberated through the air. I stumbled back further, dropping my flashlight in my panic. It hit the ground and rolled, the beam now casting erratic shadows across the forest floor, making the creature's form stretch and warp in the darkness. I turned and bolted, my survival instincts finally kicking in. The forest was a blur around me as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs pumping furiously. I could hear it behind me. The sound of heavy, thudding footsteps and that awful dragging noise. It was following me, and it was fast. Branches slapped at my face, the underbrush snagging at my clothes. But I pushed forward, adrenaline fueling every step. I couldn't see where I was going. The flashlight was back by the tree, but I didn't dare slow down. I veered to the left, hoping to lose it in the thicker part of the forest, where the trees grew closer together. But the creature was relentless. I could hear it crashing through the brush, snapping branches and tearing through foliage as it closed the distance. My lungs burned, my muscles screaming for relief, but I didn't stop. I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second, and caught a glimpse of it moving through the trees, its form hunched and contorted, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest, the fear pushing me to run faster, harder. I had to find some kind of cover, some place to hide. Up ahead, I saw a cluster of large rocks, partially hidden by thick bushes. It wasn't much, but it was my only chance. I dove behind the rocks, crouching low, trying to silence my ragged breathing. My hands shook, the adrenaline making it hard to control my movements. I pressed myself against the cold, damp stone, listening, waiting. The forest was eerily quiet again, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any noise that would tell me where it was. Then I heard it, the soft, scraping sound of claws on bark. My stomach clenched. It was close, too close. I peeked around the edge of the rock, my breath catching in my throat as I saw it standing there, just a few yards away. It was searching, its head swiveling from side to side, those eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment it paused, its gaze sweeping past the rocks, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't see me. My muscles ached with tension as I stayed as still as possible, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. The creature took a step forward, then another, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by unseen strings. It let out a low, rasping hiss, sniffing the air, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was trying to smell me out. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my chest, the sound so loud it felt like it would give me away. The creature inched closer, its claws dragging against the ground, the noise grating against my senses. I closed my eyes, willing myself to be invisible, to be nothing but part of the shadows. The hissing grew louder, the air around me thick with the stench of rot and decay. I braced myself for the worst, for the feeling of those claws sinking into my flesh, but then, suddenly, it stopped. The hissing faded, replaced by a low, mournful wail. I opened my eyes just in time to see the creature backing away, retreating into the darkness, moving back toward the hollow tree. It slipped inside, folding its twisted limbs into the impossibly small space, and then it was gone, swallowed up by the darkness of the tree's interior. I sat there trembling, my body drenched in cold sweat, unable to move. My mind reeled, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What was that thing? Some kind of forest spirit, a demon, or something older, something that had no name? I didn't wait to find out. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaky but functional, and stumbled back toward my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight, still lying on the ground where I had dropped it, and sprinted to my tent. My hands shook as I packed up my gear, my eyes constantly darting back to the tree, half expecting to see those eyes watching me again. I didn't stop until I was back on the main trail, the cabin lights of the ranger station barely visible in the distance. As I walked, I glanced back toward the forest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The tree stood silent and dark, its hollow empty, but I knew better. Some things in the forest aren't meant to be disturbed, and whatever had crawled out of that tree was one of them.